Tonight, we delve into the gilded, yet often grim, world of the Japanese courtesans, women who were much more than mere entertainers. These were figures of extraordinary artistry and social grace, elite companions who navigated complex webs of intrigue, and ultimately, survivors facing unimaginable pressures. Their lives, though outwardly opulent, concealed profound vulnerabilities. Among these hidden struggles, one subject remains particularly shrouded in shadow: the devastating reality of pregnancy for these high-ranking courtesans. Far from a joyous event, a pregnancy was a catastrophic threat, often met with desperate and shocking measures, from clandestine abortions and bizarre herbal concoctions to chilling rituals whispered about behind closed doors. Their methods were as brutal as they were heartbreaking, revealing a hidden facet of their exquisite, tragic lives. Let us set the stage, not just for a story, but for an experience. Imagine the weight of 12 layers of silk, so intricately bound that each breath is a conscious effort. Your hair, a masterpiece of lacquer and pins, feels as though it could channel the very essence of a storm. Your feet, confined within towering wooden shoes, demand a precarious balance, each step a potential stumble into the unknown. This was the meticulous, suffocating daily existence of an Edo period courtesan. Yoshiwara, old Tokyo's most famed pleasure district, transcended a mere neighborhood. It was a grand, theatrical stage, a self-contained fantasy veiled in the intoxicating haze of incense, the soft glow of paper lanterns, and a profound, collective denial of its true nature. To the adoring throngs outside, courtesans were living sculptures, ephemeral works of art. They performed elegant dances, played the soulful shamisen, and recited poetry with captivating grace. Yet, beneath this breathtaking veneer, they honed a single, paramount talent, one society valued above all others: the art of feigning absolute contentment. A crucial spoiler: they were anything but. Hidden behind their delicate fans and practiced flirtations, a courtesan's life bore less resemblance to a Cinderella story and more to that of a luxury hostage. These women were acquired at tender ages, often sold by impoverished families for a meager sack of rice and the vague, often empty, promise of a better future. Their training was rigorous, a formidable blend of an opera singer's discipline and a gladiator's resilience. There was no doubt they belonged to an elite class, but they were, unequivocally, owned. Every graceful movement, every enchanting smile offered to a client, every coin earned, ultimately belonged to another. This was typically the brothel owner, or oya, a term that, in essence, meant overlord with impeccable taste and lighting. Courtesans were commodities, valuable investments, and thus, pregnancies were deemed the ultimate product defect. After all, what could be worse for a business than its most valuable merchandise being rendered unavailable for 9 months? In a world less cruel, a courtesan might have embraced motherhood with a baby shower, a peaceful sabbatical, perhaps a quiet retreat complete with prenatal yoga and soothing hot stone therapy. But Yoshiwara was no such utopia. Here, the only stones were those that might be cast upon you for violating your contract. Pregnancy was not just a temporary inconvenience. It was an existential threat. It spelled ruin, public scandal, brutal punishment, and, quite literally, blood in the bathwater. So, while the vibrant streets outside echoed with the rhythmic clip-clop of elevated wooden shoes and the sweet, melodic laughter of illusion, the inner chambers held far darker truths. Here, secrets were whispered, hushed behind painted screens. Remedies, passed down not by compassionate healers, but by desperate survivors, became their only hope. This was a world woven from velvet and iron, exquisite and soft to the eye, yet brutal and unforgiving beneath its silken surface. For the courtesans trapped within its confines, getting pregnant was not merely a problem. It was a full-blown crisis, meticulously concealed beneath a veneer of perfect lipstick and a serene smile. If you've ever signed a contract without fully scrutinizing the fine print, you've inadvertently shared a sliver of common ground with an Edo-era courtesan. Except in her case, that fine print contained clauses far more sinister, phrases like, "You will never truly own your life again. Oh, and by the way, do not under any circumstances become pregnant, unless you harbor a fondness for profound pain, searing shame, and potentially lethal herbal poisons." Courtesans did not enter this demanding industry armed with resumes and glowing references. Most were thrust into it as mere girls, some as young as 7, by families driven by crushing poverty or simply unable to provide another mouth to feed. It was the 17th century. The concept of streaming entertainment was centuries away, so people, in their limited options, sometimes resorted to selling their daughters and conveniently attributing it to fate or karma. Once inside the brothel's walls, every aspect of their new existence bore a price tag. The exquisite kimono she wore. Debt. The fragrant hair oil that perfected her coiffure? More debt. The extensive lessons in poetry, the intricate tea ceremony, and the vital skill of feigning delight, while middle-hay guys, tonight we're peeling back the layers of silk and secrecy to step into the captivating, yet often cruelly seductive, world of Japanese courtesans. These were women who transcended the simple definition of entertainers. They were living masterpieces. Artists who commanded respect, elite companions versed in every art form, architects of intricate social dances, and, most profoundly, survivors navigating an labyrinthine existence fraught with unimaginable pressures. Yet, beneath the powdered faces and exquisite kimonos, one subject was almost never whispered about. What happened when these high-ranking courtesans found themselves pregnant? From the shadows of clandestine abortions to the desperate concoctions of bizarre herbal remedies, and even chilling rituals rumored to unfold behind tightly closed doors, their methods for dealing with an unwanted pregnancy were as shockingly brutal as they were heartbreakingly desperate. So, before you settle in for tonight's journey into the hidden truths of Yoshiwara, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe, but only if you genuinely connect with the stories I bring to you here. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Tell me where in the world you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to imagine our global community gathering, united by curiosity. Now let's set the mood. Dim the lights low, perhaps turn on a fan for that soft, almost meditative background hum. And together, let's ease into the heart of this poignant tale. Imagine, if you will, the burden of being dressed in no fewer than 12 layers of silk, each one painstakingly draped and tied, cinched so tightly you could barely draw a shallow breath. Your hair, an elaborate sculpture, styled with so many pins it felt as though it could indeed conduct lightning itself, a silent crown of exquisite agony. And your feet, forced into towering wooden shoes, called geta, so high that a single misstep wouldn't just mean a stumble, but a perilous journey straight into the next life. This, my friends, was merely the daily grind, the elegant torture of an Edo period courtesan. Yoshiwara, the incandescent heart of old Tokyo's most famous red light district, was far more than just a neighborhood. It was a meticulously crafted stage, a vibrant, ephemeral fantasy world perpetually wrapped in the intoxicating haze of incense smoke, the warm, deceptive glow of countless lanterns, and a heavy, pervasive veil of denial. To the adoring, oblivious outside world, these courtesans were living, breathing art. They moved with ethereal grace, their dances telling stories that captivated the soul. They played the shamisen, their melodies weaving through the night air like seductive spells. They recited poetry, their voices like velvet, each word a carefully polished gem of beauty. But above all, they had mastered one crucial talent, a skill society valued above all others, the art of pretending everything was perfectly fine. Spoiler alert, it most certainly was not. Behind the delicate flutter of a fan and the practiced art of flirtation, the courtesan's life was less a Cinderella story and more a gilded cage, a luxury hostage situation. These women were acquired young, often heartbreakingly so, sold into this world by their own families for little more than a sack of rice and the tragically vague promise of a better future. They were then trained with a relentless discipline that would rival both opera singers and gladiators combined. Make no mistake, they were elite, honed to perfection, but their very existence was defined by ownership. Every graceful step they took, every enchanting smile they bestowed upon a client, every single coin they earned, all of it belonged to someone else. Usually, this someone was the brothel owner, or oya, a term in Japanese that translates rather fittingly to overlord with exceptional taste in lighting. Courtesans, in the cold, transactional calculus of Yoshiwara, were products, investments. And pregnancies? Well, those were considered the ultimate product defect, because if there's one thing worse than losing money in business, it's having your most valuable, best-performing merchandise taken completely out of service for 9 months. Now, in a perfect, compassionate world, a courtesan might have been granted time off to enjoy a baby shower, a peaceful sabbatical, perhaps even a quiet retreat complete with prenatal yoga and hot stone therapy. But this, by every measure, was not a perfect world. This was Yoshiwara, a place where the only stones were the ones you might very well be figuratively stoned with if you dared to break your contract. Pregnancy didn't merely signify a temporary loss of work, it meant irreparable scandal. It invited severe punishment, and, quite literally, it meant blood in the bathwater. So, while the vibrant streets outside echoed with the rhythmic clip-clop of wooden platform shoes and the sweet, almost intoxicating sounds of laughter and music, the inner chambers of the brothels held far darker, more desperate truths. Secrets were whispered, hushed behind painted screens. Remedies were passed down, not from kindly healers, but from the gaunt, knowing hands of survivors. This was a world woven from velvet and iron, soft and alluring to the eye, yet brutally unyielding beneath its beautiful facade. And for the courtesans trapped within its gilded walls, getting pregnant wasn't just a problem. It was a crisis, elegantly draped in lipstick and powdered sorrow. If you've ever found yourself signing a contract without diligently reading every line of the fine print, congratulations. In that moment, you shared an unwitting commonality with an Edo-era courtesan. Except in her case, that fine print included soul-crushing clauses like, "You will never truly own your life again." And, with an almost casual cruelty, "Oh, and by the way, whatever you do, do not get pregnant, unless you genuinely enjoy pain, shame, and the bitter taste of herbal poison." Courtesans, quite obviously, didn't enter this intricate, unforgiving industry armed with resumes and glowing references. Most were tragically sold into it as mere girls, some as heartbreakingly young as 7, by families who were either desperate for money to survive or simply found themselves with one too many mouths to feed. It was the 1600s, an era before Netflix. So people, and all right, let's step into the shadow-draped, alluring world of the Japanese courtesans, an existence far richer and more complex than mere entertainment. These women were not just artists of dance and song. They were elite companions, honed masters of intricate social graces, and often, against immense odds, tenacious survivors navigating pressures most could never imagine. But within this meticulously crafted facade, one subject remained a dangerous secret, rarely ever whispered aloud. What transpired when these high-ranking courtesans found themselves pregnant? The answers are a chilling tapestry of desperation, from clandestine abortions to the most bizarre herbal concoctions, and even dark, unspeakable rituals murmured about only behind tightly closed screens. Their methods, born of sheer necessity, were as shocking as they were heartbreakingly tragic. Before we delve deeper into this clandestine journey, I invite you to take a moment to engage with this exploration. A simple like, a subscription, but only if you genuinely appreciate the stories we uncover here, helps us continue shedding light on these forgotten histories. And please, share in the comments where you're joining us from. It's always fascinating to see how far these narratives reach across the globe. Now, with the stage set, perhaps dim the lights a little, let a quiet fan hum softly in the background. Allow yourself to be transported as we ease into tonight's tale together. Imagine, if you can, being encased in 12 layers of sumptuous silk, each one cinched so tightly you can barely draw a full breath. Your hair, a towering edifice, is styled with enough pins to literally conduct a lightning strike, every strand lacquered into submission. And your feet, delicate instruments of balance, are forced into towering wooden geta, slippers so perilously high that one misstep could easily send you tumbling into the next life. This, my friends, was merely the dawn of a typical day, the relentless daily grind of an Edo period courtesan. Yoshiwara, the most renowned pleasure quarter of old Tokyo, wasn't just a physical place. It was an elaborate, sprawling stage, a complete fantasy world meticulously constructed and perpetually wrapped in the intoxicating haze of incense smoke, the warm, deceptive glow of paper lanterns, and an almost impenetrable veil of societal denial. To the outside world, these courtesans were living, breathing works of art, embodying grace and refinement. They danced with ethereal beauty, played the mournful melodies of the shamisen, and recited poetry that stirred the soul. But above all, they had mastered the one talent society valued above all others, the art of flawlessly pretending that everything was absolutely fine. Spoiler alert, it was anything but. Behind the fluttering fans and the practiced flirtation, the courtesan's life bore little resemblance to a fairy tale. It was less Cinderella finding her prince and more a luxury hostage situation, a gilded cage designed to captivate and exploit. These women were often acquired at a tender age, sometimes mere children, sold by their impoverished families for little more than a sack of rice and the vague, often false, promise of a better future. Once in the system, they were trained with an intensity that would put both opera singers and gladiators to shame. Rigorously tutored in music, dance, literature, calligraphy, and the intricate arts of conversation and seduction. Make no mistake, they were elite, possessing unparalleled skills, but they were also utterly owned. Every graceful step they took, every enchanting smile they offered a client, every single coin they earned belonged not to them, but to someone else. That someone else was invariably the ruthless brothel owner, or oya, a term in Japanese that, in this context, might best be translated as overlord with extremely good lighting and even better accounting. Courtesans were, at their core, products, investments, and assets. And pregnancies? Well, that was considered the ultimate product defect. Because if there's one thing worse than losing money in a business, it's having your best performing, high-value merchandise rendered utterly useless and taken out of service for 9 months, potentially for good. Now, in some idealized, perfect world, a pregnant courtesan might have been afforded a sabbatical for a baby shower, perhaps a quiet retreat complete with prenatal yoga and hot stone therapy. But this was not that world. This was Yoshiwara, a realm where the only stones you were likely to encounter were those you might be stoned with if you dared to break your contract. Pregnancy didn't simply mean a temporary loss of work. It guaranteed a catastrophic scandal. It invited severe punishment. It meant, quite literally, the looming threat of blood in the bathwater, a euphemism for the brutal reality of forced abortions or even death. So, while the vibrant streets outside echoed with the rhythmic clip-clop of platform shoes and the sweet, manufactured laughter of the pleasure quarter, the inner chambers of the brothels held far darker truths. Here, secrets were whispered behind delicate silk screens, and desperate remedies were passed down not from healers, but from weary survivors to new, trembling initiates. This was a world woven from velvet and iron, soft and inviting to the eye, but brutally unforgiving underneath. And for the courtesans trapped within its confines, getting pregnant was not just a problem. It was an existential crisis, dressed ironically in a vibrant shade of lipstick. If you have ever, in a moment of youthful naivete or hurried ambition, signed a contract without meticulously reading every line of the fine print, then congratulations. You've already shared a sliver of common experience with an Edo-era courtesan. Except in her tragic case, that fine print wasn't just about late fees or cancellation clauses. It included chilling phrases like, You will never truly own your life again. And, almost as a casual afterthought, oh, and by the way, whatever you do, don't get pregnant, unless you happen to enjoy excruciating pain, profound shame, and perhaps a dose of herbal poison. Courtesans didn't enter this industry with impressive resumes, glowing references, or a choice. Most were tragically sold into it as mere girls, sometimes as young as 7, by families crushed under the weight of poverty. They needed money desperately, or simply couldn't bear the burden of another hungry mouth to feed in an era of scarcity. It was the 1600s, remember. Netflix wasn't around, so people, in a grim twist of fate, often entertained themselves by selling their daughters into servitude and then, adding insult to injury, blaming the whole unfortunate situation on bad karma. Once ushered into the opulent yet suffocating confines of the brothel, everything, absolutely everything, came with an exorbitant price tag that only deepened their inescapable debt. The exquisite kimono she wore. Debt. The fragrant camellia hair oil that gave her locks their sheen. More debt. Even the extensive, rigorous lessons in poetry, the elaborate tea ceremony, and the soul-crushing art of pretending you were utterly thrilled by middle-aged men droning on about rice taxes. All debt. By the time she was deemed polished and ready for her first clients, she already owed more money than a modern-day failed tech startup, with no hope of ever paying it off. Now, the contract itself, and let's use that term with extreme caution, because she had no legal voice or negotiating power in its formation, was fundamentally a glorified leash. It meticulously dictated every aspect of her existence. When she slept, who she served, the precise curve of her smile, and, most cruelly of all, that her uterus was to remain strictly decorative, an anatomical ornament, never to serve its biological purpose. Pregnancy. That was most definitely not in the brochure. And let's not forget the clients themselves, a diverse collection of characters ranging from frequently drunk samurai, their bravado sloshing along with their sake, to emotionally starved merchants seeking fleeting validation, and the occasional melancholic poet who earnestly believed that whispering about cherry blossoms counted as sophisticated foreplay. These men were emphatically not looking for long-term commitment. Most weren't even looking for eye contact beyond the superficial. And if, by some unfortunate turn of fate, they managed to get a courtesan pregnant, they vanished from Yoshiwara faster than your paycheck after a particularly indulgent payday. Of course, the brothel, in its unwavering practicality, didn't dare blame the man. That would be far too progressive, an unthinkable affront to patriarchal societal norms. Instead, the woman, the walking, talking, meticulously maintained investment, was accused of appalling carelessness, as if she had simply tripped and accidentally tumbled into an unplanned third trimester. In some establishments, even the mere suspicion of pregnancy was enough to trigger a swift and brutal demotion. She'd be reassigned to the bottom rung of the brothel's hierarchy, serving the less desirable clients with fewer teeth, more complaints, and even less social standing. Or, worse yet, she'd be unceremoniously locked away in some hidden room until the problem resolved itself, a chilling euphemism for forced abortion or isolation until the pregnancy inevitably ended one way or another. You see, this elaborate world wasn't just about sex. It was about absolute control, meticulously guarded reputation, and, above all, money. And babies? Babies were emphatically, unequivocally bad for business. Because nothing, absolutely nothing, shatters a carefully constructed romantic illusion faster than a sudden bout of morning sickness. So, what exactly happens when a courtesan in Yoshiwara, a woman whose entire existence is a delicate performance of perfection, does the one thing she is absolutely, unequivocally not supposed to do? No, not fall in love. That's frowned upon, perhaps even heartbreaking, but ultimately survivable within the confines of her gilded cage. We are talking about the big one. The moment her stomach begins to noticeably grow for reasons entirely unrelated to an overindulgence in too much fish soup. Pregnancy. The ultimate, career-ending plot twist. In this elegant, silk-wrapped prison, Getting pregnant wasn't celebrated as a beautiful miracle of life. It was considered a catastrophic, career-ending biological betrayal. To translate it into modern terms, it was like your meticulously engineered iPhone suddenly deciding, without warning, that it wanted to be a toaster. Beautiful in its own way, perhaps, and potentially useful for making breakfast, but utterly useless for its intended purpose. The courtesan's meticulously defined role was to entertain, to seduce, and to flawlessly maintain the fragile illusion that every single client, no matter how hairy, how inebriated, or how emotionally unstable, was, in that moment, her one true love. A baby, a tangible, undeniable consequence of that illusion, shattered the fantasy completely. Suddenly, clients might be uncomfortably reminded that actions, even in a fantasy world, have very real consequences, and no one was paying premium rates to be jarred back to the realization that they had a real family, with real responsibilities, living across town. To the brothel, pregnancy wasn't a matter of health or human condition. It was a brutal product malfunction. A courtesan's value, her entire worth, was irrevocably tied to her constant availability, her ability to perform her duties without interruption. If she's busy gestating a small human, she's not gracefully serving tea, she's not singing enchanting songs, and she's certainly not expertly flirting with men old enough to be her grandfather. That means she's not making money, which, in turn, means the brothel is not making money. And when money isn't being made, someone, usually the Oya, is going to be very, very angry, with potentially dire consequences for the woman responsible. There were no sympathy cards, no celebratory congratulations on the new arrival banners. Just a pervasive, unsettling lot of whispering behind fans and the heavy, looming threat of being abruptly demoted from a valuable, living artwork to an unmarketable, inconvenient liability. At best, she might be hidden away in a remote part of the brothel until the issue resolved itself, a grimly poetic way of saying, handle it, or else face the consequences. At worst, she'd be summarily thrown out onto the streets, penniless, with a reputation so irrevocably tarnished that even the low-tier tea houses, desperate for any business, wouldn't dare touch her. And the baby? Let's just say this wasn't exactly a culture built on the concept of generous maternity leave or robust social support for single mothers. Pregnancy in the courtesan's world wasn't just forbidden. It was utterly, profoundly feared. Because once it happened, everything changed irrevocably. The Oiran, once the glittering, celebrated centerpiece of the district, became a silent, unspoken warning to the others. A stark, chilling reminder, cloaked in layers of silence and shame, that bringing new life into the world might very well be the act that extinguished your own. You'd think that in a place like Yoshiwara, where secrets flowed more freely than sake, where hushed whispers were currency, that something as intensely personal and profoundly delicate as a pregnancy might be handled with a quiet sympathy and delicate discretion. Yeah, no. The moment a courtesan suspected she was pregnant, a terrifying ticking clock began its relentless count in her head, not toward the joyful anticipation of motherhood, but towards certain ruin. And make no mistake, she was utterly, profoundly on her own. There were no best friends rushing over with comforting words and cravings for pickles. There were no spa days or gentle maternity massages. There were just paper walls, exquisitely fake smiles, and a whole lot of desperate, exhausting lying. Every single aspect of her life became a covert operation. Morning sickness? Blame it on some bad shellfish from the market. Fatigue? Oh, just a little tired from dancing all night, haha. A missed cycle? Oh, you sweet summer child. Don't ever, under any circumstances, utter those words out loud. Beneath the surface-level glamour of painted faces and elegant kimonos, there existed a parallel, shadow world of urgent whispers, hushed rituals, and quiet, suffocating panic. Courtesans shared their desperate remedies in a kind of coded language, passed down like haunted family recipes, each one a gamble against fate. Try the tea with 3 leaves, not 5. One might carefully advise. 5's for headaches, 3's for, well, you know. Even the seemingly simple act of checking if you were pregnant had to be executed in absolute secrecy, often relying on internal signs and desperate hope. Some girls became experts at reading their own bodies with the intensity and precision of a spy decoding enemy messages. A missed period could mean anything, right? Stress, a sudden change in diet, Mercury being in retrograde, or, as it was more commonly known in the Edo period, we pissed off another god again. And if you were absolutely certain, that's when the true, harrowing performance began. You still had to work, still had to flirt, still had to endure being fawned over by clients who, let's be honest, were likely the very cause of this catastrophe in the first place, all without them ever suspecting a thing. It was emotional espionage carried out in high heels and elaborate kimonos. Some courtesans even painstakingly altered the way they walked, subtly adjusting their posture to hide the slightest changes in their body. They'd tighten their obi belts just a little more, risking fainting from constriction rather than revealing the slightest bump. Vanity? No. Survival. And of course, all of this desperate concealment had to be done while still appearing utterly enchanting, because heaven forbid your profound emotional distress or physical agony interrupt someone's carefully purchased evening of simulated romance. Beneath the layers of silk and powdered faces were women quietly waging a brutal war against their own biology and against a world that demanded impossible perfection but offered absolutely no grace or quarter. And it all had to stay hidden, because once the secret got out, the kimono wasn't the only thing that could tragically come undone. Let's talk tea. And no, I'm not referring to the delicate kind you sip while gossiping discreetly about your neighbor's suspiciously new kimono. No, this tea had a very different, far more sinister purpose. One that came hand in hand with agonizing cramping, profuse bleeding, and the faint, ever-present possibility of death. Welcome to the courtesan's grim, secret weapon, the herbal abortion brew. Because when you couldn't exactly stroll into a pharmacy and politely ask for one discreet termination, please, you turned to Mother Nature and desperately hoped she was in a merciful mood, which she rarely was. The most infamous and often deadly players in this desperate tea party were mugwort, safflower, and kanzo, otherwise known as licorice root. The latter sounds innocuous enough, doesn't it? Until you realize it was administered in horrifying, near-toxic doses specifically designed to make your uterus quite literally flip a table, or at least attempt to. These weren't your garden-variety sleepy-time teas. These were brewed like potent, malevolent potions from a grim fairy tale. They were steeped for agonizingly long periods, taken scalding hot, and chugged down in desperate, choking gulps while praying to every god and ancestor you could possibly remember. Did they work? Sometimes. Did they also ruthlessly destroy your insides, induce terrifying hallucinations, or give you a fever so intense it felt like a direct preview of the afterlife? Also, unequivocally, yes. The recipes varied, passed between courtesans like coded scrolls, each whisper a desperate act of solidarity. Add ginger if you want it to act faster, one might gravely advise. Don't use too much safflower, or your skin will start to burn. Another might whisper, eyes wide with remembered pain. It was part rudimentary science, part terrifying superstition, and entirely an unregulated, catastrophic disaster. And the worst part? You had to keep working, keep performing the entire time. Imagine entertaining clients, forcing a sweet smile, making small talk about moonlight and cherry blossoms, all while bleeding internally and hoping desperately that this was the cup that finally did the trick. And if the tea, in its dark efficacy, didn't work, well, that just meant it was time to move on to the next method. Because in this brutal game of survival, there were no do-overs, just a terrifying, descending ladder of solutions, each one darker and more dangerous than the last. For some, the herbal tea was tragically enough. For others, it was merely the agonizing opening act in a desperate play titled, "Please Don't Let the Brothel Find Out." But the truth was chillingly clear. In the pleasure quarters, even something as innocent as a cup of tea could, in the wrong hands and circumstances, become a lethal gamble. And when your fragile life is held together by silk, practiced smiles, and desperate secrets, one wrong sip could unravel absolutely everything. If the herbal tea didn't work, and let's be honest, herbal roulette wasn't exactly foolproof, there was always another option, one far more hands-on and terrifying. Enter the midwives. But these were not the sweet, smiling, comforting birth attendants you might imagine from heartwarming folktales. No, these were women of shadows, spectral figures flitting through the alleyways of Yoshiwara, their legends passed between trembling lips. There were no signboards marking their presence, no discreet appointments, no receipts to leave a paper trail, just agonizing pain, copious blood, and a whole lot of desperate praying. They were known simply as Bazin, literally meaning old women. And many of them had, in their own tragic pasts, once been courtesans themselves, retired not by choice, but by the harsh, relentless reality of time, age, and a world that offered no savings, no pensions, and certainly no market for gray-haired flirtation. With nowhere else to go, they became grim specialists in fixing problems, unofficial, dangerous problems that society refused to acknowledge. You didn't find them by conventional means, you heard about them. A whispered name, a folded note discreetly tucked into a sleeve, a secret passed from one desperate woman to another. You knocked on the right door at the wrong time of night and prayed you had brought enough coin and, more importantly, enough courage. Their tools were usually a brutal mix of crude implements, perhaps a pot of boiling water, some cloth rags, and whatever else was lying around. Anything but surgical steel or proper sanitation, a concept centuries away from their grim reality. There was no anesthesia, no aftercare, no comfort. Just a brutal demand to grit your teeth, bear the unimaginable pain, and hope the gods were too busy to notice your transgression. And yet, to desperate courtesans, these midwives were saviors. Grim, sharp-fingered saviors who asked no questions and told no lies, understanding the unspoken stakes. Payment wasn't always money. Sometimes it was a treasured hairpin, a delicate trinket, or a luxurious silk sash, symbols of a lost life traded for a desperate chance at survival. One haunting story tells of a midwife who accepted a rare perfume bottle in exchange for her silence, then wore it daily, not for vanity, but like a bitter, warm metal. The risks were enormous. Rampant infection, catastrophic hemorrhaging, permanent infertility, or, most commonly and tragically, death. Many girls who sought their aid never returned to the brothel. The official explanation was always simple. She caught a fever. The unofficial, unspoken truth was far more terrifying. She caught reality with both hands and simply didn't survive it. If something went wrong, there was absolutely no legal recourse. After all, what could you tell the authorities? Hello, officer. I illegally sought an abortion while working in a government-regulated sex district. Could you please arrest me last? These Bazin were the final, desperate stop before utter ruin or forced exile. No formal training, no ceremony, just candlelight, trembling hands, and the horrifying hope that today, death wasn't charging full price. And somehow, even in this world of blood and fear, a profound, silent trust was forged between the broken and the ones who helped them break in silence. In most cultures, a hot bath is a symbol of peace, relaxation, a little self-care after a long, arduous day of pretending to like your job. But in the harrowing world of Edo period courtesans, a hot bath could signify something far more sinister and far more permanent. Welcome to the boiling bath method, a terrifying home remedy that promised to take care of the problem by quite literally turning your womb into a sauna from hell. The underlying, brutal idea was simple. Soak in a bath so excruciatingly hot that your body would forcibly reject the pregnancy, expelling it through sheer thermal shock. Think of it as a spa day designed by a sadistic herbalist with a profound, personal grudge against reproductive health. This method was whispered about in hushed, frightened tones behind flimsy paper screens. Stay in until you feel dizzy, they'd gravely advise. If you faint, it's working. Medical advice, at its finest, or perhaps its most barbaric. Some girls, in their desperate ingenuity, added special herbs to the scalding water. Mugwort, again, of course, because apparently that ubiquitous plant was the Swiss Army knife of uterine sabotage, deployed in every desperate scenario. Others, perhaps to dull the senses or simply compound the danger, drank sake beforehand, because why not combine internal poisoning with external overheating? It was dangerous. Extremely, lethally dangerous. You weren't just risking the pregnancy, you were risking your very life. Scalding burns, systemic shock, severe heat stroke, and cardiac arrest were ever-present threats. There are chilling accounts of women fainting mid-bath, their limp bodies being dragged out unconscious, only to die quietly and ignominiously in some hidden room while the brothel continued its bustling evening business, its illusion of pleasure uninterrupted. Nothing, after all, ruins a client's mood faster than having to step over a fresh corpse on his way to the sake tray. And yet, the method persisted because it was fast, alarmingly cheap, and relatively discreet. No tools to hide, no midwife to pay, just water, sheer willpower, and an almost superhuman pain tolerance. The courtesans were grimly instructed to breathe through the searing pain, to stay calm, to keep utterly quiet even while their bodies boiled from the inside out. Also, the brothel wouldn't lose its best, most profitable moneymaker. Because nothing screams customer service quite like telling a girl to self-harm quietly in the back room, out of sight. If the bath worked, the pregnancy ended. If it didn't, well, there were always darker options, even more desperate measures to undertake. In a world where a baby could cost you your status, your crippling contract, or your very life, a near-fatal bath wasn't considered extreme. It was, in the grim calculus of Yoshiwara, just another Tuesday. When herbal teas proved ineffective and boiling baths didn't quite do the trick, courtesans, in their relentless pursuit of survival, turned to yet another time-honored technique in the ancient art of pretending everything was fine, tight binding. The desperate idea? If you wrapped your abdomen tightly enough, perhaps, just perhaps, you could squeeze the nascent life right out of existence. Or, at the very least, you could hide it long enough to avoid an inevitable scandal and a humiliating demotion to the drunk uncles and smelly merchants' clientele tier. Enter stomach binding, known as herbal. It was essentially a DIY womb corset, a torture device masquerading as a garment. Long strips of thick cloth were wrapped, again and again, around the lower torso until the courtesan resembled a very glamorous, albeit impossibly constricted, sushi roll, one desperately holding in something she absolutely didn't want to deliver. Of course, there were significant problems, minor things like the ability to breathe deeply, proper digestion, and that pesky little issue of internal organ compression. But in the pleasure districts, comfort was always, irrevocably, optional. Image, however, was absolutely everything. Some courtesans bound themselves so excruciatingly tightly they could barely sit down, let alone perform their duties with grace, dancing, pouring tea with a serene smile, or engaging in light conversation about the transient beauty of cherry blossoms. But they did it anyway, because a visible pregnancy was the ultimate social suicide, a death knell for their entire existence. And in Yoshiwara, appearances weren't just maintained, they were fiercely, often brutally, enforced. The courtesans became consummate experts at posture control. Standing up perfectly straight wasn't merely about elegance. It was about maintaining relentless pressure on the womb, keeping the secret contained. Slouching meant a momentary loosening of the bind. Loosening the bind meant the terrifying possibility of discovery. And discovery, inevitably, meant doom. Some even slept with the binding still on, as if constricting their midsection 24/7 would somehow convince the fetus to rethink its life choices and quietly back out. It didn't, of course, and binding didn't actually stop the pregnancy. At best, it merely delayed the horrifying reveal. At worst, and far more commonly, it caused severe medical complications, ruptured tissues, debilitating dizziness, fainting spells, and perilous internal bleeding. But none of that truly mattered when the terrifying alternative was losing everything you had bled and smiled and danced to build. It wasn't about comfort. It wasn't even, ultimately, about safety. It was about raw survival and the maintenance of a fragile, life-sustaining illusion. Because in the world of Japanese courtesans, the belly must remain flat, the smile serenely perfect, and the devastating truth tightly wrapped beneath layers of silk and shame. Even if what you were truly hiding, deep inside, was profound heartbreak. At some point, one simply has to grimly admire the sheer, desperate creativity. Because when herbal teas failed, and boiling baths proved ineffective, and body wrapping didn't quite correct the issue, courtesans sometimes turned to the most comforting, or at least violent, thing available in any crisis: food. And not just any food. We're talking about rice balls soaked in sake. Yes, fermented rice, lovingly wrapped in cloth and consumed in hopes that it might, through some inexplicable magic, dissolve an unwanted pregnancy like yesterday's forgotten gossip. The logic was dubious, to say the least. The desperation, however, was agonizingly real. Folklore whispered that vinegar, sake, and certain fermented foods had weakening or abortifacient effects on the womb. Courtesans were told by each other, by weary old servants, by the clandestine midwives with half an herb shop tucked into their aprons, that if you ate just the right, potent combination of ingredients, you could somehow wash the seed away. It sounds like a tragic fairy tale, a desperate incantation, and in many ways, it truly was. The specific recipe varied by district, even by individual brothel. In one establishment, the go-to method involved warm sake mixed with crushed garlic and pickled plum, a concoction that probably tasted like pure despair with a distinct hint of nausea. Another popular combination featured rice balls marinated in vinegar, ginger, and, unsaid but present, shame. Served cold, very cold. Did it work? You already know the answer. Not really. Unless you count violent vomiting and excruciating intestinal distress as results. But in a world where your entire future hinged on successfully hiding your condition, even a placebo with brutal side effects was worth trying, a flicker of hope in an otherwise dark existence. Some courtesans were even told to chant little verses while eating their grim meal. Part spiritual ritual, part emotional coping mechanism, a whispered plea to the universe. Something along the lines of, "Return to the river, little child, for now is not your time." And then they would swallow, fighting back the inevitable urge to gag, hoping against all reason that these words, combined with the bitter food, would somehow change their fate. There's something incredibly human and heartbreakingly naive in this particular method. A kind of hopeful magic passed between trembling hands, a shared, desperate belief. Because unlike the brutal efficiency of the midwife's crude instruments or the searing agony of the boiling bath, this one felt gentler, almost like a ritual, almost like a prayer. But no amount of sake, no matter how lovingly fermented, could rewrite biology. And while the rice balls, in their tragic delusion, offered a sliver of emotional comfort, they rarely, if ever, offered actual results. Still, courtesans kept trying. Because when your body isn't truly your own, and your choices are limited to agony or absolute secrecy, sometimes the only power you have left is believing in something. Even if that something is merely a soggy rice ball soaked in old liquor and whispered regret. So, let's paint this grim picture. A courtesan gets pregnant. She's terrified, perhaps bleeding internally from herbal teas, possibly half-poached and scarred from a boiling bath. And she's tried every desperate rice ball concoction in the folklore cookbook. Naturally, the next logical, utterly human step might be to tell the father, to seek some modicum of shared responsibility. Ah, sweet child, that man is already gone. Courtesans did not operate in a world where paternity was a shared responsibility, where emotional bonds forged in the pleasure quarters held any real-world weight. They operated in a meticulously constructed fantasy, a dream the client paid handsomely for. And the very minute that delicate fantasy tried to become a messy, inconvenient reality, the man vanished, disappearing faster than a samurai caught in a scandal. Most clients were married men, respectable figures with established families and reputations to uphold. Others were powerful officials, wealthy nobles, or prominent merchants, all with carefully cultivated public images they absolutely did not want associated with illegitimate children from the pleasure quarters. So, when that courtesan nervously hinted that there might be consequences, the reaction was almost universally predictable and brutally cold. "Ah, sorry, I'm suddenly moving to Osaka permanently. Also, I don't believe I know you." Courtesans, through harsh experience and rigorous training, were conditioned not to expect loyalty, much less love. That's precisely why any genuine emotional attachment was considered a dangerous liability, a weakness that could be exploited. But still, many women, in their profound human vulnerability, held on to a fragile, desperate hope that the man they saw week after week, who brought thoughtful gifts and shared intimate secrets, might actually do the right thing, might acknowledge his part. He almost never did. Even in the exceedingly rare cases where a client wanted to help, there were insurmountable layers of legal and social barriers that made public acknowledgement nearly impossible. Claiming the child meant a devastating scandal. Scandal meant dire consequences, social ostracization, financial ruin, and irreparable damage to their family name. And for most Edo-era men, consequences were the one thing more terrifying, more unpalatable than commitment itself. Some, perhaps assuaging a flicker of guilt, tried to leave money quietly. A few gold coins slipped discreetly to a brothel servant with vague instructions to take care of it, a distant, cold form of abandonment. Others simply pretended they didn't recognize the woman at all, a cruel and dehumanizing erasure. You have to understand, the courtesan, in the eyes of her clients and society, was a fantasy embodied, a living dream. And fantasy, by its very nature, doesn't get pregnant. So when reality rudely knocked in the form of morning sickness, swelling feet, or a missed cycle, the men did what men have done in countless chapters of history, across myriad cultures. They got really, really good at ghosting. The father's silence wasn't just literal. It was cultural, institutional, practically a tradition woven into the very fabric of society. No messages, no visits, no names etched onto ceremonial scrolls. Just the abrupt, chilling silence, another shadow swallowed by a world already dense with untold stories and forgotten faces. The father, a fleeting phantom, simply vanished, leaving not a trace in the physical realm or the collective memory. And for the courtesan, there was no space to unburden her heart, no luxury of grief or righteous rage. Her world demanded an uninterrupted performance, an unwavering facade. There was only the next choreographed gesture, the next intoxicating lie whispered for a client, and the insidious, growing silence blossoming like a dark secret within her womb. Pregnancy, for any woman, could be a profound upheaval. For a courtesan, it wasn't just a personal disaster. It was an apocalypse, an existential threat complete with devastating consequences, a complete absence of sympathy, and certainly no celebratory baby shower. The brothel, you see, was far more than mere employment. It was an entire cosmos, a gilded cage encompassing every facet of her existence. It was her landlord, dictating her meager living space, her agent, controlling her every engagement, her stylist, crafting her elaborate illusions, her de facto parole officer, monitoring her every move. All these roles were rolled into one formidable, unyielding institution. And like so many systems built on profit rather than humanity, it operated under one inviolable, golden rule: asterisk, don't get pregnant. So, what transpired when a courtesan made this most unforgivable transgression? It was never handled with a gentle touch or a private, compassionate discussion. There were no comforting words. No, we're here to support you platitudes. Instead, a palpable shift in the air, a silent judgment that manifested as knowing side eyes from her peers, the crisp, passive-aggressive snap of a fan from an Oiran, and the relentless, suffocating dread that she was about to be utterly crushed beneath the gilded wheels of the brothel's unforgiving machine. The moment the faintest suspicion stirred, perhaps when she moved with a subtle, uncharacteristic slowness, or picked at her food with less enthusiasm, or simply carried herself with an almost agonizing care, the whispers began. They slithered through the paper screens, weaving through dressing rooms and hushed tea ceremonies. First came the rumors, sharp as slivers of ice. Asterisk, she's getting fat. Asterisk. Asterisk, she looks pale, doesn't she? Asterisk. Asterisk, I heard she skipped her cycle. From the maid who empties the chamber pots. Then, the surveillance tightened. Suddenly, she was never permitted to leave her room unescorted. Her supposed friends were discreetly, or not so discreetly, coerced into reporting on her activities. Her workload diminished, not out of any newfound compassion, but as a chilling indicator that the brothel was already preparing her replacement, ready to erase her as if she'd never existed. And finally, when their suspicions hardened into certainty, came the punishment. Its severity was a chilling lottery, varying wildly depending on the brothel's mood, its social standing, and its particular appetite for cruelty on any given day. Some establishments demoted the offending courtesan to the lowest echelons, forcing her to endure the company of the roughest, most intoxicated, and least hygienic clientele imaginable. Others confined her to the suffocating solitude of her room until she dealt with the issue, a euphemism heavy with unspoken horror. Still others simply cast her out, without a coin or a shred of support, leaving her with nothing but a silk bundle filled with shame and a stark, public warning to any who might dare follow in her footsteps. In the most elite houses, there was a meticulous facade of discretion. They might announce she was on retreat for spiritual contemplation or visiting ailing family. But every single soul within Yoshiwara knew precisely what that meant. Pregnancy was not merely a personal failing. It was a grave business risk, an unwelcome contamination of the meticulously crafted illusion. In a system built entirely on the fragile scaffolding of fantasy, the harsh intrusion of reality was considered not just inconvenient, but utterly rude. So, when the brothel discovered her secret, there were no compassionate tears, no comforting embraces, only cold, calculated assessments. The slow, quiet erasure of a woman who had dared to break the one unspoken rule, a rule everyone else pretended wasn't already irrevocably shattered by their very existence. When every herbal tea had been consumed in vain, when vinegar-soaked rice balls had been choked down until nausea seized her, when she had all but boiled herself alive like some forgotten overseas dumpling in a desperate attempt to abort, and the brothel began to eye her with the critical, unforgiving gaze reserved for a faulty lantern, two stark options remained: confess and face the chilling, premeditated consequences, or run like hell. And some courtesans, against all odds, chose exactly that. They disappeared, vanishing into the labyrinthine alleys and forgotten corners of the city. In the pleasure districts, they were branded ninja jororo, a scornful term roughly translating to runaway prostitutes, or more cuttingly, she messed up the fantasy, now go fetch her back. Because running away was not merely frowned upon, it was explicitly illegal. These women were considered property, assets bound by contract and debt. And when property walked out the door, especially with the added complication of a new life on board, the brothel took it as a personal affront, a profound challenge to their ownership. Yet, that dire reality did not stop them. Some courtesans fled in the dead of night, shedding their opulent, burdensome identities like a snake sloughing off its skin. They donned plain, coarse robes, their elaborate coiffures unbound, hair falling wildly around their shoulders. They slipped like wraiths through shadowy alleyways, hid within laundry carts rumbling out of the district, or even, improbably, crammed themselves into sake barrels. Yes, barrels. It was a dramatic, perilous, and desperately cinematic bid for freedom. Where did they go? Anywhere that didn't demand perfume and perpetual pretense. A distant cousin's humble farm, a secluded mountain shrine lost amidst the mist, a sleepy fishing village where no one bothered to ask questions unless you were caught stealing their precious sake. These were places where the very name Yoshiwara, once a key to every lock, now slammed doors shut. But not everyone made it. Some were caught, brutally dragged back, and subjected to public punishment. A grim spectacle serving as both a chilling warning to other restless souls and a morale booster for the remaining, terrified staff. Asterisk look what happens when you act like you have free will. Asterisk others disappeared so completely they transcended into whispered urban legends. Asterisk did you hear about the Oiran who ran off to become a nun? Asterisk. Asterisk they say one lives in the hills now, reading fortunes and raising her child like a ghost. But even running was not true freedom. It was merely a different kind of cage, a trade-off where the glittering makeup and temporary wealth were exchanged for silence and the grim struggle for survival. And yet, for many, it was the only choice that still felt like a choice. Because when your entire world is meticulously painted in strict rules and blood-red lipstick, the most terrifying prospect isn't leaving. It's staying and perpetually pretending that the unbearable burden within you simply doesn't exist. So they ran, not for vengeance, not for grand rebellion, but for the smallest, most dangerous luxury of all, hope. Let's imagine a courtesan who couldn't run, couldn't drink enough bitter teas to make the problem disappear, couldn't fake enough dazzling smiles to mask the truth. Eventually, the lie she carried swelled beyond any silk kimono's ability to conceal. There was only one final, unthinkable path, to give birth quietly, invisibly, preferably without anyone ever knowing. Welcome to the underground world of silent deliveries, where motherhood arrived in the dead of night, behind thin, sliding paper doors. Towels, perhaps even a silk obi, were stuffed into mouths to muffle screams that dared not be heard. There were no birthing chairs, no cheerful midwives in starched aprons, no cries of joy echoing through the room. Only urgency, profound terror, and if she was exceptionally lucky, the quiet, competent presence of someone who knew how to boil water without uttering a single question. Sometimes, these clandestine births occurred in secret rooms, hidden alcoves the brothel conveniently pretended not to know existed. Other times, it was a cramped storage closet behind heavy drapes, or even outdoors, beneath the unforgiving blanket of darkness. Because nothing quite speaks to the beautiful miracle of life like squatting in the chill night behind a public bathhouse, a handkerchief clenched between your teeth, praying for swiftness and silence. The courtesan had to maintain an almost superhuman calm, for any excessive noise risked not just scandal, but brutal exile, or something far, far worse. There was no fanfare, no joyous name-picking ceremony, just a tiny bundle of blood and breath, hastily wrapped in a cloth and hidden away before the first blush of dawn. If she was truly fortunate, a loyal servant girl or an old, retired courtesan, a woman who had seen and endured everything, might offer aid. These were women whose mouths were sealed tighter than lacquered boxes, who brought warm towels and whispered prayers, and who, crucially, never dared to ask what would become of the baby afterward. And the baby, well, that was the unspoken question, the one no one dared voice. Some infants were taken away almost immediately, their fleeting presence erased before it could even register. Others lingered, hidden for a few precarious days, tucked into a dark corner, fed in desperate silence, loved with trembling, terrified hands. But everyone knew this was temporary. A child, a symbol of innocence and new beginnings, simply did not belong in the pleasure quarters. There was no room for such purity amidst the artifice and weary joy of Yoshiwara. What these women endured, physically and emotionally, is almost unspeakable, a testament to unimaginable strength. But they endured because the alternative, the brothel's wrath, the public shame, was always worse. They gave birth like ghosts, then wiped their faces, meticulously fixed their elaborate hair, and returned to the brothel floor as if nothing had happened, another performance flawlessly executed. Because in Yoshiwara, the show, no matter the cost, must always go on. If a courtesan managed the impossible feat of giving birth in secret, one overwhelming problem still remained. A tiny, crying, impossibly fragile problem. In the pleasure districts, babies weren't blessings, they were liabilities with lungs. Loud, hungry, and utterly impossible to explain to your next discerning client. So what was she to do? Under the cloak of night, she would walk to the very edge of town, to a quiet roadside, to a place explicitly built for tragedy, a shrine of abandonment. Known as koya or ubisit sites, these were unassuming stone shrines, tucked away in the forgotten corners of society, existing somewhere between a place of worship and a desolate dumping ground. They were never publicized, never spoken of openly, yet everyone knew they existed, and everyone understood their heartbreaking purpose. A mother, often a courtesan, a servant, or any woman society had brutally failed, would leave her infant on the cold stone steps, swaddled tightly. Sometimes, a name would be whispered and written on a small paper charm. Other times, there was nothing but a folded prayer tucked into the cloth. Then, with a heart ripped in two, she would walk away. No goodbye, no witness, no turning back. If she was lucky, a kind monk or a compassionate stranger might find the child, a flicker of hope in the darkness. Sometimes, a temple would take them in, raising them in quiet anonymity. Other times, they were passed to orphanages or sold into servitude, or simply vanished into the vast, silent folds of forgotten stories. The courtesan did not abandon her child because she did not care. She did it because there was no other conceivable path. The brothel would never allow a child to exist within its walls. The law offered no protection, only condemnation. And even if she successfully ran, what future could she possibly offer a vulnerable baby while constantly hiding from bounty hunters, possessing nothing but a hair comb and a blood-stained obi? So she did the unthinkable, not out of cruelty, but out of a love so profound and twisted by desperation that it defied comprehension. Some of these shrines were rumored to be haunted. Locals claimed they heard crying at night, not from the abandoned infants, but from the anguished women who had left them there, echoes of regret, carved into the whispering wind like invisible gravestones. It wasn't just a shrine, it was an altar to every dream that never stood a chance. And the worst part? No one ever needed to ask who left the child, because in the floating world of courtesans, everyone already knew. They just pretended not to. In the intricate tapestry of Japanese tradition, an unborn or aborted child is never just a medical footnote. It is a spirit, a soul. And in the shadowy world of the courtesan, these spirits were everywhere, a pervasive, melancholic presence. They were called Mizuko, literally water children, a poetic, beautiful name for something profoundly heavy, laden with sorrow. These were the souls of children who were never born, or who were born and never raised, never allowed to truly flourish. And no matter how silent the birth, how quiet the abandonment, these spirits did not simply disappear. They lingered. Mizuko were believed to float perpetually between worlds, not fully in the vibrant realm of the living, yet not quite passed on to the afterlife either. In many haunting ways, they mirrored the women who carried them. Courtesans, after all, also existed precariously between realities, glamorous yet enslaved, adored yet ultimately discarded, present in body but often unseen in spirit. And so, a strange, profound kinship formed, one ghost carrying another through life. Some women were haunted, not just by overwhelming emotion, but by a deeper, spiritual malaise. It was said that unhonored Mizuko could cause misfortune, illness, or terrifying nightmares. And the courtesans, who possessed no true freedom in life, sought a measure of peace, a kind of freedom, for their unborn children in death. That is where the Mizuko Q came in. A secret ritual, a whispered apology, a profound emotional exorcism wrapped in the quiet comfort of prayer beads and fragrant incense. The ceremony was small, intimate, sometimes held at a secluded temple beyond the district's clamor, sometimes performed in utter privacy late at night, with only a flickering lantern illuminating trembling hands. Offerings were carefully placed, tiny baby toys, fresh flowers, little red bibs meticulously tied around the gentle shoulders of Jizo statues, the compassionate Buddhist guardian of children and travelers. Courtesans couldn't raise their children, but through this ritual, they could implore the gods to protect them. It was the only parental act they were allowed, and it was utterly heartbreaking. Imagine lighting incense for the child you never got to name, whispering, "I'm sorry." Not because you didn't love them, but precisely because you did, with every fiber of your being, in a world that cruelly denied you the space to show it. Some women returned again and again, year after year, unable to forget, drawn back by an invisible, agonizing tether. Others visited once and never returned, too terrified to reopen a wound that festered perpetually beneath the surface. But all of them carried it, that profound, unacknowledged burden. Because even in a world meticulously constructed for forgetting, some memories, some loves, simply refused to drown. Mizuko were not just spirits. They were indelible reminders that love existed, however briefly, however tragically, even in the darkest, silken corners of Yoshiwara. The pleasure district of Yoshiwara was a symphony of constant, vibrant noise. Laughter, often forced, echoed down lantern-lit alleys. The melancholic strum of the shamisen and the lilting melodies of koto floated through sliding paper doors. Perfumed clients shouted declarations of love they clearly didn't mean. Courtesans giggled, poured sake, and spun 100 intoxicating lies an hour, all for the price of maintaining a captivating illusion. But beneath all that raucous sound, something remained perfectly, chillingly still. Silence. A specific, deliberate kind of silence, the kind that wrapped itself around certain topics like a velvet chokehold. And at the very heart of that silence lay the unwritten, unspoken rule. We don't talk about pregnancy. Every courtesan carried an invisible weight, the crushing burden of contracts, impossible expectations, crippling debt, and suppressed desire. And for the ones who became pregnant, that weight tripled overnight, multiplying with terrifying speed. It pressed on their lungs, suffocated their decisions, permeated their very skin. But somehow, impossibly, they kept dancing. They still performed, still laughed at jokes they'd heard 1,000 times, still painted their lips blood red, and pretended they weren't bleeding somewhere else entirely, in a place unseen and unacknowledged. Because true strength in Yoshiwara wasn't about brute force, it was about sheer endurance. It was the ability to carry your pain like it was just another exquisite part of your costume. To cry only when your makeup was safely waterproof. To bind your womb, bind your heart, and keep serving tea with a flawless smile, as if nothing inside you was slowly, irrevocably unraveling. Some might say they were trapped, and indeed they were. Yet, even within the confines of their gilded cages, they found clandestine ways to sing. They learned to master control, not over their inescapable fate, but over how they wore it. They consoled each other with subtle gestures, a knowing glance, a gentle touch, rather than dangerous words. They protected secrets, not out of shame, but because trust was a rare and sacred currency in their treacherous world. They taught younger girls the quiet codes of survival, how to hide, how to lie convincingly, how to endure just one more day in a system that profited immensely from their enforced obedience. They were not fragile like glass, easily shattered. They were fragile like porcelain, exquisitely beautiful, dangerous to mishandle, and yet capable of enduring centuries of immense, sustained pressure. No one wrote poems about that kind of strength. There were no plays, no vibrant woodblock prints immortalizing their inner fortitude, only silence and relentless survival. But if you looked closely, in the subtle tilt of a head, the momentary narrowing of the eyes, the slight, almost imperceptible tremble in the hands pouring tea, it was undeniably there. They were artists, yes, masters of illusion and grace, but they were also unyielding warriors, painted in rouge and wrapped in layers of silk. And for those who carried the unbearable, the unborn, the forgotten, the nameless shame no one dared to utter, the very fact that they still stood at all, still breathed, was strength disguised as elegance, disguised as grace. But make no mistake, it was strength of the most profound and unyielding kind. They were never meant to be remembered. Courtesans existed to be consumed, admired, desired, painted in vibrant hues, yes. But understood? Never. Once they faded from the ephemeral spotlight, they were swept aside like yesterday's forgotten incense smoke, especially the ones who dared to become pregnant. There were no grand statues erected in their honor, no poems carved in enduring stone, no history books meticulously recording the names of the girls who bled quietly behind screens, who left heartbreaking offerings for children no one else ever saw, who simply disappeared into the night with swollen bellies and broken contracts. But they existed, and they mattered. Behind every fan flutter and every practiced laugh was a human being surviving the impossible. They carried beauty like armor and shame like an inescapable shadow. They were punished for wanting love, exiled for making life, and buried in the footnotes of history like an inconvenient truth. And yet, they still found defiant ways to fight, not with swords or rousing speeches, but by simply enduring, by clinging to moments of fleeting kindness in a world engineered to forget them, by protecting each other in small, quiet, rebellious ways, a whispered warning, a smuggled remedy, a silent prayer offered at a shrine that smelled of old moss and ghost stories. Remembering them isn't just about demanding justice. It's about reclaiming truth. It's about pulling back the shimmering silk and acknowledging what was truly there all along. The heartbreak, the unyielding resilience, the quiet rage of women forced to choose between mere survival and their own shattered selves. They weren't weak. They weren't shameful. They were trapped in a brutal system that commodified their bodies and criminalized their humanity. And still, they endured. Some are honored only by the faded red bibs adorning weathered Jizo statues. Some are remembered in the aching, bittersweet melodies of old shamisen songs. Most remain unnamed, unheard, and unseen. But tonight, we remember them. Not just the courtesans they were trained to be, but the mothers they were never allowed to become. The daughters sold too soon. The women who survived the unspoken war waged inside the brothel walls. They lived in the shadows. But that doesn't mean they should stay there. War. It didn't start with a cannon blast or a deafening roar. No, the moment that would irrevocably transform the American West forever arrived with deceptive quietude, as soft and unassuming as the ceaseless flow of the American River itself. It was January 24th, 1848. James W. Marshall, a diligent carpenter overseeing the construction of a sawmill for a visionary named John Sutter, was performing a routine inspection of the tail race, the man-made ditch that channeled water away from the churning mill wheel. The water was rushing a little too fast, churning up the riverbed. Rocks had shifted, and the soil needed clearing. Then he saw it. A subtle flicker, a brief, tantalizing flash, a distinct yellow gleam shimmering in the muddy, shallow waters. Gold. He bent down, scooped it up, and rolled the tiny, weighty nugget between his fingers. Then, almost instinctively, he bit it, a crude but common test in those days to ascertain if such impossible wealth had truly arrived. He showed it to a colleague, then, with a mixture of awe and trepidation, presented it to Sutter himself. And Sutter, upon comprehending the monumental implications of this discovery, didn't cheer. He didn't celebrate with triumphant shouts. He panicked. Sutter harbored a meticulously cultivated dream, an expansive empire built on agriculture, peaceful and endlessly profitable, utterly devoid of the chaotic, avaricious throngs of treasure hunters. A gold rush, he instantly understood, would unleash unimaginable chaos, squatters descending like locusts, opportunistic thieves, bitter land disputes, and a complete unraveling of his carefully laid plans. And it did, just not immediately. For a brief, tantalizing moment, they managed to keep it quiet. A secret fortune, a private revolution whispered between a chosen few. That fragile moment of secrecy, however, was destined not to last. Within weeks, the whispers, like an insidious contagion, echoed across smoky saloons and remote trading posts. By spring, the docks of San Francisco Bay witnessed an astonishing sight. Sailors, gripped by an insatiable fever, were abandoning their ships mid-voyage, deserting their posts to chase the irresistible rumor. Entire towns, once bustling, emptied overnight. Men, propelled by an unseen force, ran from their jobs, from their homes, even from their families, all chasing a singular, river-born dream. What began as a mere fluke, a serendipitous glint on the edge of a sawmill, would ignite the single largest mass migration in American history. Gold fever, raw and virulent, was airborne, and no one, it seemed, was immune. By the time word, carried by clipper ships and slow, overland routes, finally reached the distant East Coast, and then trickled across vast oceans to the bustling ports of China, the rugged shores of Chile, and the burgeoning settlements of Australia, it was already too late. California was no longer just a distant, vaguely understood frontier. It was an all-consuming obsession, a glittering siren song, all because one man, in a moment of ordinary labor, had seen an extraordinary glimmer in the dirt. It wasn't the first time gold had been found on American soil, but it was the first time it irrevocably rewrote the future overnight. This wasn't just a discovery, it was a spark, and everything, from the landscape to the very soul of a nation, was about to catch fire. By the dawn of 1849, California had ceased to be a distant rumor. It was a powerful magnet, and the world, it seemed, was iron. Tens of thousands of people, overwhelmingly men, were in motion, an unstoppable human tide. From the cobbled streets of New York to the sultry bayous of New Orleans, from the foggy docks of London to the sun-drenched plazas of Lima, from the crowded markets of Canton to the treacherous waters off Cape Horn, the rush had begun in earnest. They came on foot, boots worn to shreds, pushing creaking wagons through blistering deserts and over ice-choked, impassable mountains. They came on ships, rounding the perilous tip of South America, enduring months at sea, their meager savings sacrificed for just the faintest chance at a golden miracle. They were a motley crew, wide-eyed dreamers, desperate men escaping their pasts, intrepid adventurers, cunning crooks, even determined widows disguised as men to brave the male-dominated frontier. Entire fleets of ships were abandoned in San Francisco's once tranquil bay, their crews deserting en masse, scrambling inland with nothing but shovels and gold pans. Some, witnessing the chaos, called it sheer madness. Others, with fervent belief, hailed it as destiny. By the end of that single, tumultuous year, California's population had exploded, rocketing from barely 15,000 to over 90,000 souls. San Francisco, once a sleepy port town, ballooned into a wild, chaotic boom town, its streets a jumble of canvas tents, makeshift gambling halls, and hastily thrown together wooden shacks. The insistent clang of hammers and the rhythmic scrape of pickaxes filled the air, competing with the cacophony of saloon music, drunken shouting, and the occasional, jarring crack of gunfire. There were no established banks, no formalized law enforcement, no rudimentary plumbing, just a rampant gold fever and the raw, untamed insanity that accompanied it. They proudly called themselves the 49ers. Most arrived poor, sun-scorched, and covered in the omnipresent dust of the trail. They carried little more than a fierce, blind hope and a few crude tools, a pickaxe, a shovel, a gold pan, perhaps a tin plate or two. Few possessed any actual mining experience. Even fewer would ever truly strike it rich. Yet, the potent allure of the dream was powerful enough to utterly erase the daunting odds. One man might tirelessly dig for months, finding nothing but rock and mud, his back aching, his spirit dimming. Another, in a stroke of improbable luck, could stumble upon a sparkling nugget the size of a walnut and suddenly be rich beyond his wildest imagination, at least until he inevitably lost it all in a drunken, ill-fated poker game. And still, they came. Every creaking wagon that journeyed westward carried more than just tools and meager supplies. It carried unbridled ambition, crushing desperation, and a fierce, almost religious belief in reinvention. The powerful conviction that out here, past the very edge of civilization, a man could shed his old skin and become something entirely new. 1849 wasn't just a year on a calendar. It was a seismic breaking point, reshaping not only the physical landscape of California, but the very idea of America itself, a nation now consumed by an insatiable obsession with movement, with the pursuit of sudden fortune, and with the enduring, seductive myth that the next shovel full of dirt might just change everything. When the gold came, the towns followed, springing up almost overnight in a testament to human ingenuity and greed. A lone miner, perhaps, struck it rich near a remote stream. Word, as always, got out, carried by whispers and hastily scribbled notes, and suddenly, hundreds of canvas tents popped up like mushrooms after a summer storm. Within a matter of weeks, those flimsy tents gave way to more permanent, albeit still rudimentary, timber shacks. A saloon, its doors always swinging, opened. Then 2, then 10. A blacksmith, essential for repairs, arrived. Perhaps a rudimentary newspaper, crudely printed. Another gambling hall. And just like that, a town was born. They called them boom towns because they didn't merely grow, they exploded into existence. Places like Hangtown, Whiskey Town, and Rough and Ready weren't meticulously planned urban centers. They were raw, visceral manifestations of pure adrenaline and blind, unyielding hope. There were no mayors, no formalized laws, no sidewalks, just ubiquitous mud, rivers of whiskey, and a whole lot of men with pickaxes and notoriously short tempers. By day, these determined men clawed at the hillsides, panning the icy rivers until their fingers ached and turned blue. By night, they drank, gambled away their meager fortunes, brawled, and made terrible, impulsive decisions in candle-lit saloons thick with cigar smoke and desperation. Fortunes could be won with one lucky swing of a pickaxe, only to be lost in a single, ill-fated hand of poker. There were no consistent rules, or rather, there were too many, made up on the spot and enforced by whoever had the biggest gun or the loudest, most intimidating voice. Justice, if it could be called that, was improvised and often brutal. Established courtrooms were a rarity. Swift, terrifying lynch mobs were not. But it wasn't just pervasive lawlessness that defined these settlements. It was profound loneliness, too. The population was overwhelmingly male. For every woman who dared to venture west, there were dozens, sometimes hundreds, of men. Letters from the distant east spoke of crushing homesickness, of heartbreak for abandoned families, and of men crying quietly by flickering campfires, their faces etched with regret. The true gold, for many, wasn't always in the ground. Sometimes, it was just a fading memory of what they had so recklessly left behind. Some towns, defying the odds, flourished for a time. San Francisco, as mentioned, transformed from a sleepy, dusty harbor into a rowdy, bustling gateway to the gold fields. But many others did not last. When the gold veins dried up, the people vanished as quickly as they had appeared. What was once a buzzing, chaotic boom town became a silent ghost town. Buildings left to rot under the unforgiving sun, saloons still stocked with broken glasses, the wind whistling mournfully through empty jail cells. The gold rush didn't just create towns, it devoured them, spitting out forgotten remnants. For every glittering success story, there were hundreds of shattered dreams buried beneath muddy floors and abandoned tools. Yet, no one who came west expected guarantees. They came for a chance, a glimmer of possibility, and the boom towns, chaotic, filthy, and burning with a desperate hope, were where that chance lived, however briefly, however fiercely. For a little while, the phrase gold fever sounds romantic, conjuring images of easy riches and grand adventure. That is, until you find yourself knee-deep in freezing river water, your hands numb, relentlessly swinging a pickaxe into unyielding rock, sleeping on hard dirt under an indifferent sky, and calling a can of beans your only reliable friend. The reality of a prospector's life was far from glamorous. It was a grinding existence of hard labor, pervasive loneliness, and often profound misery. But still they came. Because the intoxicating promise of riches, even the slimmest, most improbable chance of it, made men capable of enduring impossible things. Most arrived with little more than that potent hope and a few essential tools: a sturdy pickaxe, a reliable shovel, a prized gold pan, and perhaps a tin plate or two. If a man had accumulated a little capital, he might splurge on a rocker box, a wooden contraption that allowed him to sift through significantly more dirt at once. If he was truly flush with cash, he might even acquire a long tom sluice, a more elaborate system for separating gold from gravel. If not, his entire operation came down to the sheer force of his two hands, the relentless pull of gravity, and an almost endless reservoir of patience. Panning for gold meant hours bent over a frigid river, swirling sediment, hoping to catch that elusive flicker of yellow amongst the dark, smooth rocks. Some, in moments of improbable fortune, struck it rich in a single day. The vast majority did not. They dug endless holes, moved countless boulders, built intricate wooden flumes to divert water, dammed creeks, and chased every tantalizing rumor of easy gold like moths drawn irrevocably to a deadly flame. They slept in flimsy canvas tents if they were lucky, or under the vast, indifferent open skies if they weren't, their dreams of fortune flickering against the overwhelming darkness. Rain was more than just wet clothes. It was an insidious dampness that clung to every fiber, seeping into bones, inviting a chill that no meager fire could truly banish. Snow didn't just mean frozen boots. It was a torturous descent into numbness, threatening frostbite and the slow, agonizing loss of toes. Every rustle in the undergrowth could be a bear, a massive shadow of teeth and claws, or worse, a desperate thief, equally dangerous, lurking in the shadows of a lonely claim. Fear was a constant companion, a tightening knot in the stomach. Disease, however, was the most relentless predator. In the squalor of hastily erected camps, where proper sanitation was an alien concept, dysentery, scurvy, and cholera swept through the population like wildfire. Miners, often too exhausted or too ill to care, certainly weren't washing their hands before shoveling down their meager rations. The food itself was a monotonous, grim affair, basic, yet outrageously expensive. Imagine eggs, a simple staple, costing more than a day's backbreaking labor. Beans, bacon, and coffee formed the unholy trinity of the miner's diet, a repetitive, gut-wrenching menu. Fresh vegetables were a mythical rarity, and bathing, a forgotten luxury. Haircuts? A whimsical memory from a life left far behind. And yet, despite the misery, the pervasive stench of desperation and unwashed bodies, the ever-present threat of death, they stayed. Why? Because the gold was real. People, ordinary men, had found it. The glint of a nugget, the weight of a pan full of flakes. These were not mere rumors, but tangible proofs. If they could, perhaps you could, too. This was the true sickness, the insidious addiction that gnawed at their souls. Every back-breaking failure, every empty pan, every exhausted collapse, still held the flickering ember of hope that the very next shovel of dirt, the next plunge of the pan, might finally change everything. So they dug, day after weary day, month after brutal month, year after desolate year. Some, tragically, never found more than dust and shattered dreams. Their bodies, broken by toil and disease, were often left behind, marked by a crude wooden cross or simply absorbed by the unforgiving earth. Others, the truly fortunate few, unearthed enough to dramatically alter their lives, or at the very least, afford the luxury of a single hot bath and a sturdier pair of boots. But success in the gold fields wasn't merely about striking it rich. The ultimate test was tenacity. In that muddy, chaotic crucible, sheer grit was often the only thing that separated the legendary figures whose names whispered through the camps from the countless lost souls swallowed by the wilderness. Gold didn't simply emerge from the earth. It came with a staggering price tag, meticulously written in the blood, sweat, and broken promises of those who sought it. For all the thrilling narratives of overnight fortunes, the unvarnished truth was far grittier. The vast majority of miners never became rich. Many only found enough to scrape by, perpetually teetering on the edge of survival. Countless others departed poorer than they had arrived, carrying nothing home but blistered hands, shattered health, and a profound, gnawing regret. Yet, the cost of the gold rush wasn't solely a personal ledger of suffering. It was a national reckoning. California, contrary to the pervasive gold rush mythology, was never an empty expanse awaiting discovery. Long before the frantic influx of prospectors, the land thrived as home to hundreds of thousands of Native Americans, living across dozens of distinct nations and tribes, their lives interwoven with the rhythm of the earth. But once gold was discovered, these vibrant cultures, these ancient communities, were cynically regarded as little more than an inconvenience, an obstacle between unbridled ambition and unimaginable profit. As miners poured in, native lands were ruthlessly seized, their sacred rivers poisoned with mercury from mining operations, their forests indiscriminately cut down, their ancestral homes burned to the ground. Rivers that once teemed with salmon, a vital food source and spiritual artery, became choked with mining debris and toxic sludge. Wildlife vanished, their habitats obliterated. And the people themselves? They were systematically pushed out, hunted down like animals, subjected to brutal enslavement, or outright killed. The burgeoning California state government, far from protecting them, actively funded militias whose horrific mission was to clear the land, paying bounties for Native American scalps, a chilling testament to the institutionalized violence. By 1870, California's native population had plummeted by over 80%. What had begun as an economic frenzy, a wild rush for glittering metal, quietly but decisively morphed into a genocidal tragedy. But native tribes were not the sole payers of this horrific price. Mexican and Chilean miners, seasoned prospectors who had skillfully worked California's hills long before 1849, soon found themselves targeted by racially motivated laws and vicious mobs. Chinese immigrants, arriving in waves, having crossed the vast Pacific in cramped, wooden boats, fueled by famine, poverty, and the shimmering promise of Gold Mountain, were burdened with exorbitant taxes and brutally driven from their claims through sheer violence. Black miners, both free and enslaved, faced an unrelenting barrage of legal discrimination and physical threats at every single step of their arduous journey. Even among white miners, brotherhood was a fragile concept. Disputes over claims erupted frequently, often escalating into all-out brawls or terrifying gunfights between rival camps. Fortune, far from uniting, bred intense friction and suspicion, for every man believed, with fervent conviction, that he alone deserved the ultimate prize. Gold, in its rawest form, brought chaos. It twisted morals, like a cancerous growth within the human spirit. It rewrote values, eroding the very foundations of decency. Men who had once held steadfast beliefs in family, the rule of law, and the sanctity of the church, now found themselves resorting to bribery, blatant lying, outright stealing, and sometimes the ultimate transgression, killing, all for a mere glint in a pan. Because once a man saw gold, truly saw its mesmerizing gleam, his soul, it was whispered, never quite looked the same again. The California Gold Rush wasn't merely an historical event. It was a consuming fever, a profound, often brutal, transformation of land and spirit. And for every precious ounce pulled from the unforgiving ground, something else, something vital, was buried deeper still: justice, peace, community, or even the faint whisper of a conscience. Gold may have glinted seductively in the rivers, beckoning with false promises, but true justice? That was an infinitely harder commodity to find. In the nascent days of the California Gold Rush, the concept of real law was practically non-existent. California wasn't even an official state yet. It was a sprawling, lawless, and rapidly changing frontier where a man's wealth, or more often, the intimidating size of his revolver, was the primary arbiter of right and wrong. In this vacuum, the miners, out of necessity, improvised their own crude rules. They formed what were called mining codes, loose, often unwritten agreements delineating claim sizes, boundaries, and expected behavior. If someone dared to break these fragile rules, they were hauled before a jury of their muddy, exhausted, and often highly prejudiced peers. But fairness, in this wild landscape, was a notoriously relative concept. Stealing a shovel might earn you a stern warning. Discovering a valuable nugget on what another man believed was his land, however, might get you summarily hanged. Yes, hanged. Vigilante justice, swift and brutal, quickly became the norm. With a woeful scarcity of official sheriffs, burgeoning towns formed vigilance committees, self-appointed enforcers, notoriously quick to punish, and rarely burdened by the inconvenient formalities of trials or evidence. Suspects could be whipped until their backs were raw, forcibly run out of town, or even strung up to a tree with a rope around their neck, often based on little more than suspicion or a whispered accusation. Saloons, in this turbulent era, were far more than just places to drink away the day's toil. They served as impromptu courtrooms, raucous gambling halls, and sometimes terrifying execution grounds. A drunken insult, hurled in the haze of cheap whiskey, could escalate in moments into a deadly shootout. A lost card game might abruptly end in murder. Gunsmoke and lawlessness danced a macabre tango side by side, beneath the flickering, swinging lanterns. Theft was rampant, a constant threat to every miner's hard-won earnings. Claim jumping, the brazen act of attempting to take over another man's established land, could ignite all-out war between rival camps, turning neighbors into sworn enemies. Property lines, in this chaotic environment, were often decided with bone-shattering fists, whistling bullets, or hastily scribbled signs nailed crudely to trees, marking territory with a desperate hope for peace. Yet, amidst this churning maelstrom of chaos and desperation, something truly strange and unexpected began to happen. Communities, fragile at first, began to emerge from the dust. Makeshift governments, mirroring the desperate need for order, slowly formed. Real sheriffs, not just self-appointed enforcers, were actually elected. Towns, rather than simply expanding their gallows, started to construct courthouses, symbols of a nascent rule of law. California, driven by this explosive growth, even drafted a constitution in 1849, a full year before it officially achieved statehood in 1850. The mythic Wild West had begun, slowly, violently, and unevenly, to tame itself. But the deep, indelible scars of that early lawlessness never quite healed. Because in the anarchic gold fields, justice had always been a thing improvised, a reaction to immediate need, rather than an ingrained principle. And even when the structures of formal law finally arrived, for countless souls, they came far too late. Their dreams, their lives, buried beneath the hills, forgotten in dry creek beds, or swinging tragically from the very tree branches that had once doubled as their arbitrary judges. The California Gold Rush wasn't merely an American story. It was a worldwide alarm bell, and its clang resonated with astonishing force across continents. By 1850, the bustling San Francisco Bay had become a global port, its waters dotted with ships from every corner of the earth. Their sails, heavy with the winds of distant lands, bore decks equally heavy with the hopeful, desperate weight of dreamers. Gold fever had gone truly global, and California was no longer just a place on the map. It had transmuted into an intoxicating idea, a shimmering beacon of possibility that drew people like a powerful magnet. They arrived from Chile, seasoned miners whose hands already knew the feel of raw gold from South America's own rich fields, long before the fateful discovery at Sutter's Mill. They came from Peru, Mexico, and the distant West Indies, bringing with them not only their invaluable mining skills, but also the vibrant spices that flavored their food and the melodic strains of their music that would forever enrich the emerging culture. From China, thousands embarked on the perilous crossing of the vast Pacific in flimsy wooden boats, driven by the twin specters of famine and poverty, but also by the potent, mythic promise of Gold Mountain. Europe, too, sent its share of hopefuls. Irish fleeing the Great Famine, Germans escaping political upheaval, Italians seeking new opportunities, and Frenchmen, many escaping the revolutions, poverty, or wars that racked their homelands. Even a handful of hardy Australians showed up, having chased their own gold rushes down under, and figured they'd try their luck once more on yet another continent. California rapidly became a swirling, churning, multilingual chaos, a vibrant, bewildering kaleidoscope of humanity. Tents from every nation were pitched side by side, their canvas walls barely separating the cacophony. Arguments and celebrations alike were shouted in a dozen different dialects, a tower of Babel rising from the mud. Cooking fires, scattered across the hillsides, filled the air with exotic scents from 5 distinct continents, a delicious, confusing aroma of global migration. At first, there was a fleeting illusion of something beautiful, a grand global gathering, all drawn by the same universal dream of prosperity. But dreams, like the land itself, often have borders, and when gold became scarce, that initial camaraderie curdled rapidly into bitter prejudice. Foreign miners were increasingly viewed with deep suspicion, often outright hostility. Their successes, no matter how hard won, were resented, their accents mocked, their very presence seen as an intrusion. Discriminatory laws, such as the infamous foreign miners' tax, were swiftly introduced, specifically targeting non-American miners with steep, crippling fees and relentless harassment. Chinese miners were especially vulnerable, often driven from their claims by brute force, beaten, sometimes even murdered, while local officials conspicuously looked the other way. Spanish-speaking miners, even those who had been born in California and whose families had lived there for generations, faced pervasive legal discrimination and mob violence. Racism, in this frenetic era, was not merely a casual prejudice. It became entrenched policy. Still, many endured. They stayed, their resolve unyielding, and began to build. They erected communities, temples, churches, and businesses, laying the foundational stones of a new society. San Francisco's vibrant Chinatown took root, a testament to resilience. Latino towns thrived along the ancient Spanish land grants, preserving threads of a longer history. And even as they were pushed to the margins, these global pioneers, with their diverse skills and cultures, undeniably helped to shape the future of California, influencing its food, enriching its language, and defining its unique, independent spirit. The gold rush didn't just bring people west, it brought the entire world west. And for better or worse, it vividly demonstrated what happened when disparate cultures collided not over lofty ideals, but over the raw, glittering lure of gold. Gold, like any finite resource, has a way of running out. Even when the fever it ignites still burns fiercely in the human heart. By the mid-1850s, the once bustling rivers had grown noticeably quieter. The easy gold, the glittering flakes and readily accessible nuggets that could be scooped from shallow stream beds with little more than a pan, was largely gone. What remained was buried deeper, far harder to reach, and required expensive, sophisticated tools that most individual miners simply couldn't afford. The frantic rush was definitively over. Those who had arrived expecting instant wealth now confronted a cruel, undeniable truth. The gold rush had never been a promise, only a monumental gamble. And for the vast majority, the house had emphatically won. Some, with dwindling options, chose to stay, transitioning from independent panning to wage labor in the burgeoning large-scale mining operations. These industrial outfits introduced hydraulic mining, a devastating technique where massive jets of water were blasted at entire hillsides, literally tearing them apart to extract the precious metal. It was undeniably faster, far more efficient, and utterly devastating to the landscape. Mountainsides were shredded beyond recognition, Rivers became hopelessly clogged with debris and toxic mercury, and fertile farmland downstream was irreparably ruined. The gold might have still been flowing, but it came at an unforgivable environmental cost, and a tide of lawsuits would eventually bring hydraulic mining to a halt decades later. Meanwhile, many of the original 49ers packed up their meager belongings and left, broken by exhaustion, ravaged by illness, or simply crushed by profound disappointment. Some returned home, their pockets as empty as their spirits. Others drifted into new frontiers, Oregon, Nevada, Colorado, forever chasing the next tantalizing rumor, the next elusive miracle. And a steadfast few remained. They became shopkeepers, ranchers, teachers, and mayors. They built California not with shovels and pans, but with deep, enduring roots. Because while the gold itself was drying up, something else, far more profound, had taken a powerful hold: possibility. California had transformed beyond recognition. No longer a forgotten, desolate territory on the fringes of the continent, it now boasted roads, bustling ports, thriving towns, nascent newspapers, and reliable banks. And finally, statehood. In 1850, a mere 2 years after James Marshall's accidental discovery, California officially joined the Union, a testament to its explosive growth. The gold rush was over, but its impact was irreversible, etched deeply into the fabric of the nation. It had redrawn the map of America, filling the vast West with people, ambition, and, sadly, violence. It had shattered indigenous populations, transformed the national economy, and turned a sleepy frontier into a vibrant symbol of American reinvention, a land where anything seemed possible. What had begun with a simple sparkle in a river ended with an empire in relentless motion. And while the miners eventually moved on, California itself stayed gold, not just in its rich hills, but in its powerful, enduring legend. Because sometimes, the greatest treasure isn't what you dig up from the earth, it's what you build, painstakingly, after the digging finally ends. The gold rush concluded, yet its powerful echo never truly stopped resonating. Even today, nearly 2 centuries later, California still wears the gold rush like a second skin, an intrinsic part of its identity. Its iconic nickname, the Golden State, and its proud motto, Eureka! I have found it, are anything but subtle. This wasn't just a fleeting historical event. It became a defining national identity, a cultural myth baked deep into America's very DNA. Because the gold rush wasn't just about the metal itself. It was about reinvention, about the audacious belief that one could cast aside an old life and forge a new one. It taught a young, hungry nation that fortune wasn't merely inherited. It could be chased, relentlessly dug for, fiercely fought for. It instilled the conviction that you didn't need a noble name or inherited wealth, just a shovel and a spark of wild, desperate madness. It was, in many ways, the very beginning of the American dream as we know it today. Move fast, take risks, stake your claim, and carve out your own destiny. But this legacy, like much of history, is complicated, scarred by injustice. Yes, it undeniably brought rapid growth, fueled innovation, and spurred the birth of the modern West. It gave rise to the iconic city of San Francisco, accelerated the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, and transformed California into a global cultural and economic giant. But it also left behind deep, agonizing wounds. Native communities were pushed to the brink of erasure, their cultures systematically dismantled. Vast, beautiful landscapes were ravaged, scarred by man's avarice. Racist laws and brutal violence created lasting wounds that fester to this day. Chinese laborers, Mexican miners, black pioneers, they, too, built California, brick by painful brick. But their invaluable stories, their immense contributions, were largely buried under the glittering, convenient myth of the lone white prospector with the lucky pan. And yet, people still come. Perhaps not for literal gold, but for something remarkably similar, for tech, for fame, for personal reinvention, for that elusive next big thing. Silicon Valley, the epicenter of modern ambition, isn't geographically far from Sutter's Mill, the very site where gold was first discovered. The tools have evolved, from pickaxes and pans to lines of code and algorithms, but the fundamental hunger, the unyielding desire to strike it rich and change one's stars, remains precisely the same. That is the real, enduring legacy of the gold rush, the deeply ingrained belief that somewhere, just over the horizon, with enough guts, ingenuity, and a dash of sheer luck, everything can fundamentally change. The gold rush wasn't just a rush for metal. It was a profound collision of cultures, of ambitions, and often of grand illusions. It revealed both the best and the absolute worst of human nature, all compressed within the span of a single, tumultuous decade. And it turned one accidental discovery into one of the most transformational, foundational chapters in American history. The gold is mostly gone now, but the powerful dream it sparked, that dream is still digging. Helen Adams Keller was born on June 27, 1880, in Tuscumbia, Alabama, a place of verdant green fields, sprawling cotton farms, and the pervasive warmth of the southern sun. Her parents, Arthur and Kate Keller, were utterly thrilled. She was, by all accounts, a picture of health, beautiful, bright-eyed, and brimming with a boundless curiosity. Her blue eyes sparkled with intelligence, and her soft, eager laugh was music to their ears. For the first 19 months of her life, Helen was, in every joyous aspect, just like any other child. She learned to crawl with energetic determination, to babble her first joyful sounds, to smile with radiant recognition at her mother's loving face, and to chase dancing shadows across the sun-drenched porch. She adored the family dog, reveled in the scents and textures of the sprawling garden, and delighted in the gentle caress of the wind. Her world, a kaleidoscope of vibrant sound and vivid color, was full to bursting, until, with terrifying suddenness, it wasn't. In February 1882, a mere few months shy of her second birthday, Helen was struck down by a mysterious and debilitating illness. Some whispered of scarlet fever, while others believed it was a virulent form of meningitis. Doctors, in their limited understanding of the era, were baffled, unable to diagnose or provide real comfort. All anyone could do was wait, agonizingly. For days, her tiny body burned with a ferocious fever, racked by uncontrollable tremors. Her mother, Kate, a constant, terrified presence, hovered helplessly by her bedside. And then, mercifully, the fever broke. Helen, against all odds, survived. But the cost of that survival was staggering, an immeasurable price. She could no longer see. She could no longer hear. The vibrant, colorful, noisy world had turned irrevocably dark and silent, as if the illness had slammed a heavy, soundproof door shut, brutally sealing her inside the confines of her own small body. She was not yet 2 years old. At first, her family clung desperately to the hope that it was temporary. Perhaps she was merely recovering slowly, her young brain still healing. Maybe her eyes would adjust, her hearing would gradually return. They would call her name, ring a bell, whistle for the dog. Anything to elicit a response, a sign that the connection was not entirely severed. But as days bled into weeks, and weeks into months, the crushing truth became undeniably clear. Helen had been irrevocably cut off from the very senses that connect us, that ground us, to the vast, communicative world around us. Now, truly imagine this, a bright-eyed toddler, brimming with nascent energy and burgeoning intelligence, suddenly rendered utterly unable to comprehend the loving faces smiling down at her, the comforting arms reaching out to embrace her, the familiar voices calling her name. She had no language, no symbols, no conventional way to express the simplest wants or the most primal fears. Frustration, a silent, raging inferno, began to fill the suffocating silence of her world. Then, a searing, uncontrollable rage followed. She learned, through sheer instinct, to mimic simple actions, to open doors, to nod or shake her head, but without any true understanding of the underlying meaning. Her world became a bewildering, terrifying blur of textures, vibrations, and smells. And inside her, a storm, a tempest of inarticulate fury, constantly brewed. By the tender age of 5, Helen Keller was described by many as a wild child, a spirited, intelligent, and fiercely strong-willed girl, yet completely, frighteningly unmanageable. She would scream with deafening intensity, kick out with all her strength, and even lash out, hitting those around her. This was not born of cruelty, but of profound, desperate isolation. She was a mind locked within an impenetrable fortress, and no one, it seemed, knew how to reach her. Not yet. By the time Helen Keller reached her 5th birthday, the cheerful, inquisitive toddler who once played joyfully in the garden had transformed into something else entirely. Untamed, explosive, and utterly unreachable. Imagine, if you can, being imprisoned in a realm of total darkness, a void devoid of all sound, all sight, all language. Just raw, unfiltered sensation and a relentless, terrifying confusion. For Helen, life had become a disorienting blur of textures and instincts, a constant battle against an unseen enemy. She possessed no words to articulate her hunger or her fear, no way to grasp the concepts of comfort or discipline, no means to communicate her needs. So, naturally, she lashed out. She threw violent tantrums that shook the house, kicked furniture with furious abandon, ripped buttons off clothes in frustrated rage, and even slapped her baby sister out of a primal, uncomprehending jealousy. Her meals became chaotic battlegrounds. She ate with her hands, grabbing food indiscriminately from others' plates, and erupted into furious screams whenever anyone dared to try and correct her behavior. Her mood swung wildly and without warning, from bursts of uninhibited laughter to paroxysms of terrifying rage. The Kellers, utterly exhausted and increasingly desperate, simply didn't know what to do. Their daughter was undeniably intelligent. That much was obvious. She had figured out complex routines, learned how to open doors, unlock cabinets, even mimic simple household tasks. But her very intelligence, trapped and undirected, made her defiance even more dangerous, her will more unyielding. Her parents were at their wits' end, physically and emotionally drained. Relatives, with hushed, pitying whispers, suggested that she belonged in an asylum, a place where she could be managed, if not understood. But her mother, Kate, refused to give up. With a fierce, unyielding determination, she began writing letters, searching desperately for help, not just from doctors, but from anyone, anywhere, who might possess the unique insight to reach a child like Helen. The trail of hope, slender but persistent, eventually led them to Alexander Graham Bell, the renowned inventor of the telephone, who, in addition to his technological marvels, was also deeply involved in the education of the deaf. Bell, while not possessing the immediate solution himself, offered a crucial suggestion. He directed them toward a pioneering institution in Boston, the Perkins Institute for the Blind. And at that school, a young woman, barely out of her teens, was recommended to travel south and meet the Kellers. Her name wasn't Sullivan. She was just 20 years old, visually impaired herself, having battled her own significant challenges, poor, fiercely determined, and, by her own admission, completely unprepared for the storm of frustration and brilliance she was about to walk into. When Sullivan arrived in Tuscumbia, Alabama, in March 1887, she was greeted by a child who was undeniably bright and beautiful. Uncombed hair a wild halo, eyes that glinted with untamed mischief, a defiant grin that hinted at both intelligence and rebellion, and a scream that, she quickly discovered, could truly shatter windows. Helen Keller wasn't inherently cruel. She was desperately trapped. The world, in its cruelest irony, had shut its doors firmly in her face, and she, with every ounce of her fierce young spirit, was pounding on them with everything she had, a primal cry for release. And Sullivan had one job, a singular, daunting mission: open the door. And nothing, not Helen's rage, not the suffocating silence, not her impenetrable blindness, was going to stop and from trying. March 1887, Tuscumbia, Alabama. A young woman named Anne Sullivan, fueled by an unwavering determination, had arrived, ready to attempt the seemingly impossible task of teaching the unteachable. Her first decisive step was radical. She moved into a small cottage on the Keller property, taking Helen away from the indulgent main house, away from distractions, and away from the pity that had inadvertently stifled her. Anne's method was revolutionary in its simplicity, structure, consistent discipline, and above all, language, the key to unlocking Helen's mind. But how do you teach language to a child who can neither hear words nor see letters? And began by meticulously spelling them into Helen's hand, one distinct letter at a time, using the manual alphabet specifically employed by the deaf. DOLL. She would sign into Helen's palm as she handed her a doll. Helen, a quick study, copied the movements with surprising accuracy. She was intelligent, undoubtedly curious, but to her, these intricate finger movements were merely a fascinating, if meaningless, game, a form of finger play with no conceptual meaning attached. She could mimic 100 different signs and still not grasp the fundamental truth that things had names, and was relentless, driven by an unshakable conviction. She spelled the names of everything Helen touched: C-A-K, M-U-G, S-P-O-N, W-E-T-R, B-R-E-A-D, K-Y. Yet, the child stubbornly failed to connect them. There was no concept yet, no profound understanding that the fleeting shapes in her palm represented the tangible world around her. Then came April 5, 1887, a day that would forever be etched into the annals of history, a watershed moment. And, with a flash of inspiration, led Helen to the old water pump just outside the cottage. In one hand, she carefully placed Helen's eager fingers directly under the gush of cool, life-giving water. With her other hand, with deliberate, slow precision, she spelled into Helen's palm, W-E-T-R, again and again and again. The sensation of the cold water splashing, the rhythmic movement of Anne's fingers spelling the word, W-E-T-R. Suddenly, Helen froze. The internal chaos, the storm of confusion and frustration that had plagued her young mind for so long, miraculously calmed. Her face, previously a mask of bewilderment, slowly, beautifully lit up with an incandescent wonder. She dropped the mug. She touched the damp earth beneath her feet and spelled E-A-R-T-H. She touched the cold, metallic pump and spelled P-U-M-P. She touched Anne's dress, then her face, then, with an astonishing realization, her own hand. She had gotten it. For the very first time in her life, Helen Keller understood, with a clarity that transcended mere sensation, that everything had a name, and that words, those previously elusive symbols, could be touched, felt, learned, and used to unlock the world. That single, profound moment shattered the suffocating walls that had imprisoned her since infancy. A door, previously locked and barred, had swung open, and Helen, once trapped in silent, impenetrable darkness, had finally found her miraculous way through. By nightfall of that same epical day, she had learned 30 new words. She would, in time, go on to learn thousands. But that was the moment, the precise instant the silence broke, and the world, for the very first time, had meaning. Once Helen understood that words possessed meaning, there was simply no going back. The metaphorical door had not only opened, but she now yearned to run through it, to explore every crevice of the newly accessible world. Her mind, starved for language for so many long years, ravenously devoured everything and offered. Nouns, verbs, adjectives. She wanted to name the entire world, every tangible object, every fleeting sensation, every complex emotion. Nothing was too small, too abstract, or too intricate for her voracious intellect, and, invigorated yet exhausted, could barely keep pace with her students' astonishing hunger. She taught Helen using real-world experience, immersing her in the sensory richness of their surroundings. They walked through fragrant gardens, touching soft petals of flowers, rough leaves, the textured bark of trees, the cool, crumbly soil. Helen learned the word flower by feeling the delicate bloom of a rose, tree by wrapping her small arms around its sturdy trunk, storm by standing in the exhilarating rush of rain. And she didn't just want to know what things were. She demanded to know why they were. She began posing deep, philosophical questions that belied her young age. What is love? Where does the sun go at night? Why do people cry? This wasn't mere memorization. It was a profound awakening of her spirit and intellect. She also began to grasp the nuances of manners and morality, not just the simplistic yes and no, but the complex interplay of right and wrong, and spelled stories into her eager hand. Timeless biblical parables, Aesop's fables filled with wisdom, poignant poems, and enchanting fairy tales. Through these narratives, Helen learned about kindness, the sting of selfishness, the warmth of generosity, and the crucial importance of justice. Language, she discovered, wasn't merely a tool for power, it was the ultimate freedom. Helen even began writing her first simple sentences using a special slate with raised lines, a guide for her fingers. Each word she painstakingly spelled made her feel more human, more seen, more connected. The raw frustration that had once driven her to scream and violently break things had now transformed into a powerful, focused sense of purpose. But none of this happened by accident. And Sullivan worked tirelessly, often for 16 exhausting hours a day, to unlock Helen's staggering potential. She wasn't just a teacher. She was Helen's translator to the world, her unwavering mentor, her fierce protector, and her closest, most trusted friend. The bond that grew between them was deeper than family, closer than blood itself. And, who had once described herself as half-blind and unwanted, was now, with every passing day, shaping one of the most remarkable minds in human history. And slowly, steadily, the world began to notice. Newspapers started publishing incredible stories about the miracle child in Alabama, the deaf-blind girl who was now reading, writing, and learning at a pace far faster than anyone had ever believed possible. Helen's hunger for knowledge wasn't slowing down. If anything, she was just getting started. Because now that she had a voice, even if it came through the intricate dance of fingers in a palm, she yearned to speak to everyone. And one day, soon, she would. By the age of 10, Helen Keller had already defied the most audacious expectations. She could fluidly read Braille, construct full, coherent sentences, and communicate rapidly and expressively through fingerspelling. She devoured books with an insatiable appetite, memorized long, complex poems, and engaged in spirited debates about complex ideas with her extraordinary teacher, Anne. But even this astonishing progress wasn't enough for Helen's restless, ambitious spirit. She didn't just want to communicate. She yearned, with every fiber of her being, to speak. The very idea seemed absurd, an impossibility born of wishful thinking. She was both profoundly deaf and irrevocably blind. How could she possibly learn to form words she had never heard, shaped by sounds she had never experienced? But Helen wasn't asking for permission. She was demanding instruction, a pathway to her next impossible dream. So, in 1890, her supportive family sent her to the Horace Mann School for the Deaf in Boston. There, she met Sarah Fuller, a dedicated and compassionate speech teacher who, despite the monumental challenge, agreed to attempt the impossible. The method they devised was exquisitely tactile. Helen would carefully place her sensitive fingers on Sarah's lips, cheeks, and throat as she spoke. She felt the subtle vibration of sounds, the precise shape of the mouth as it formed words, the intricate movement of the tongue within. Then, slowly, painstakingly, with immense effort and unwavering determination, she began to mimic them, letter by agonizing letter, word by word. She practiced endlessly, forming syllables in front of mirrors, feeling her own face as she spoke, repeating each elusive sound dozens, even hundreds, of times. Her very first articulated word was it. Next came is, then I have. Small steps, indeed, but imbued with giant courage. It was far from easy. Her voice, at first, was difficult to understand, a strained, often guttural sound. Even those closest to her struggled to make out her halting words. But Helen never gave up, never faltered, because to her, speech represented a profound, new level of freedom, a direct bridge to the world she had never truly entered, a world of audible conversation. And every single day, her pronunciation, with relentless practice, improved. And Sullivan remained steadfastly by her side through every fumbling attempt, every small triumph, encouraging, gently correcting, and celebrating every hard-won success. Together, they transformed what seemed like an impossible miracle into a repeatable method. By the age of 12, Helen could speak full, articulate sentences. With time and continued practice, she would learn to give powerful speeches, recite poetry with moving eloquence, and even engage in lively, intellectual conversations, though most people still required an interpreter to understand her clearly. But that, ultimately, didn't matter. Because Helen Keller had achieved what even the most ardent optimists thought impossible, she had given sound to silence. She possessed no memory of ever hearing her own voice, of the rich tapestry of spoken language. And yet, through sheer force of will, she had created one, with breath, muscle, and an indomitable, pure defiance. She had found her voice, and she would dedicate the remainder of her extraordinary life to using it, to giving voice to the voiceless. By her mid-teens, Helen Keller had already achieved more than most people could ever hope for in an entire lifetime. But she wasn't content with simply being recognized as a miracle. She yearned for something more, something fundamental, to be educated, truly, formally, completely. She then aimed for a goal unprecedented for anyone deaf and blind: college. The sheer audacity of the decision reverberated through society, sparking a mix of awe and derision. While some marveled at her courage, others dismissed it as a futile, attention-seeking stunt. But Helen, fortified by an unwavering inner resolve, remained impervious to the critics. She enrolled at the Cambridge School for Young Ladies, a prestigious preparatory institution designed to groom women for entry into Radcliffe College, Harvard's esteemed sister school. The academic journey was nothing short of brutal, and Sullivan, her indefatigable companion, attended every single class, meticulously spelling out entire lectures into Helen's hand, letter by painstaking letter, hour after relentless hour. Imagine the colossal effort of absorbing complex information, from the nuanced philosophical debates to intricate scientific principles, when you couldn't see the blackboard, couldn't hear the professor's voice, and had to process every single word through the delicate vibrations against your palm. Every textbook demanded transcription into Braille, a laborious process that meant a single volume could take weeks, even months, to complete. Every examination required agonizingly slow dictation, word by agonizing word. Helen plunged into a demanding curriculum, mastering Latin, French, algebra, geometry, philosophy, history, and literature. Her days stretched endlessly, often extending into nights even longer as she pushed her limits. Many evenings, she would collapse into bed, her hands aching from the constant tactile communication, her mind still spinning with the torrent of new knowledge. This relentless pursuit was not without its toll. There were raw moments of pure, overwhelming frustration, quiet tears shed in despair, bone-deep exhaustion, and even whispers of self-doubt. Yet, she never surrendered to these shadows. Her indomitable spirit pressed on, culminating in her acceptance into Radcliffe College in 1900. With that singular achievement, Helen transcended the role of mere student. She instantly became a powerful, living symbol of what the human spirit could achieve against seemingly insurmountable odds. The world watched, captivated. Newspapers breathlessly chronicled her progress, and photographers tirelessly sought to capture her in moments of study, reading, and writing. The public clamored to witness the blind girl with a mind, eager for a glimpse of the perceived miracle. But Helen recoiled from the idea of being a mere spectacle. Her deepest desire was to learn, to pursue knowledge not as a novelty or an object of fascination, but as an equal among her peers. At Radcliffe, she continued her rigorous studies, even as a palpable skepticism lingered among certain administrators and faculty members. Some professors openly questioned her intellectual capacity, doubting her ability to truly comprehend complex subjects without sight or sound. Others found in Sullivan's constant, visible presence in the classroom to be a distraction. But Helen, through sheer force of will and undeniable academic prowess, systematically dismantled these prejudices, proving her keen intellect over and over again. In 1904, at the age of 24, Helen Keller graduated cum laude from Radcliffe College, forever cementing her place in history as the first deafblind person in the world to earn a college degree. She had confronted the ivory towers of academia without the senses most take for granted, and she had triumphed magnificently. This was far more than a personal victory. It was a resounding public declaration, echoing across the globe, that disability did not equate to inability. It was a testament to the fact that the human spirit, when given even the slightest opportunity and fueled by boundless determination, possessed the capacity to transcend and outshine every conceivable limitation. And Helen, armed with her hard-won education, articulate voice, and burning conviction, was only just beginning. She immediately redirected her formidable intellect and energy toward a new, equally challenging battlefield: activism. Helen Keller, though unable to hear the roar of a cheering crowd or see her name emblazoned in print, possessed an acute, visceral understanding of injustice, and she steadfastly refused to remain silent in its face. With her formal education complete, Helen stepped confidently into a new, purposeful role. No longer simply a student, she emerged as a tireless fighter, a powerful voice for the unheard, and an unwavering symbol for those the world had too long ignored. She became a fierce and tireless advocate for the rights and dignity of the blind and the deaf. Yet, her compassion and commitment knew no narrow bounds. Helen's activism swiftly expanded to encompass a sweeping range of social injustices. She fearlessly took on the systemic issues of poverty, championed women's suffrage, confronted deeply ingrained racism, fought against the horrors of child labor, and passionately advocated for workers' rights. She unapologetically criticized powerful corporations, openly supported birth control, and even became an outspoken critic of war. The prevailing public expectation was for a quiet, delicate woman, perhaps a figure to be admired from afar for her personal triumphs. What the world received instead was a political firestorm. In 1909, she boldly joined the Socialist Party, arguing with articulate conviction that capitalism, unchecked, was systematically crushing the poor while disproportionately enriching the wealthy elite. This radical stance deeply shocked many of her erstwhile admirers. Individuals who were perfectly comfortable applauding her miraculous triumph over personal disability, but were profoundly uncomfortable with her challenging their deeply held economic beliefs and, perhaps, their own bank accounts. When one dismissive critic accused her of being misled by socialist ideology, Helen delivered a devastating and now legendary retort. "It is true that I am blind and deaf, but I am not blind to social injustice, nor deaf to the cries of the suffering." She traveled extensively, delivering lectures to captivated audiences across the country, often with and Sullivan faithfully by her side, interpreting her every word. She met with an astonishing array of world leaders, presidents, renowned authors, and fiery revolutionaries. Helen was unequivocally blunt, brilliantly incisive, and utterly impossible to dismiss. She tirelessly campaigned for the American Foundation for the Blind, playing a pivotal role in raising crucial awareness and vital funding across the nation. Her efforts were instrumental in lobbying Congress for the inclusion of Braille books in public libraries and passionately championing equal educational opportunities for all disabled individuals. Beyond her public appearances, she poured her intellect onto the page, authoring books, essays, columns, and countless letters. Her pen, indeed, became a sword, and she wielded it with fearless precision and unyielding conviction. In the public eye, She was an enduring paradox, a woman who could neither see nor hear, yet who possessed a profound clarity of vision that surpassed most, and whose words resonated with a power far greater than those blessed with perfect voices. She consistently demanded dignity, not merely for herself, but for all marginalized, voiceless, and forgotten members of society. And while many inevitably disagreed with her progressive politics, no one, absolutely no one, could ignore her monumental presence. Helen Keller, the woman who had once been locked in a silent, sightless world without words, had now become the very force whose words were actively changing that world. As Helen Keller gracefully aged, the world's admiration for her only grew louder and more profound. She had truly become a global icon, a transcendent symbol of courage, unwavering intellect, and boundless human will. From the bustling streets of Tokyo to the ancient sands of Cairo, from the political corridors of Washington, D.C., to the grand squares of Moscow, her very name evoked something immensely powerful: hope. She embarked on extensive world tours, visiting more than 35 countries, tirelessly advocating for the blind and the disabled, inspiring millions wherever she went. Crowds gathered in vast numbers, not just to hear her speak, but simply to witness her walk onto a stage. Heads of state, humbled by her presence, would bend low to shake her hand. Children, their eyes wide with wonder, would reach out to touch her, as if hoping to absorb some infinitesimal spark of her extraordinary fire. And yet, behind the thunderous applause and global accolades, there was always a persistent shadow. And Sullivan, Helen's indispensable companion, devoted teacher, and dearest friend, began to experience a serious decline in her health during the 1920s. For decades, their lives had been inextricably intertwined, two souls fused into one by shared struggle, profound understanding, and an enduring love. But in 1936, the unthinkable happened, and Sullivan passed away. Helen was utterly devastated, plunged into a grief so profound it threatened to consume her. She had known the encompassing darkness of blindness, the profound silence of deafness. But this, the new, absolute silence left by Anne's absence, was different. It was a silence deeper, colder, and more crushing than any she had ever known. And still, remarkably, she carried on. She found solace and unwavering support in Polly Thompson, who stepped into the monumental role of her new interpreter and companion. Together, they continued the mission, a testament to Helen's unyielding spirit. Public speaking engagements, relentless fundraising efforts, tireless lobbying, and prolific writing. Helen refused to slow down, maintaining her vigorous schedule even into her 70s. In 1948, she embarked on an emotionally charged tour of post-World War II Japan, where she met with wounded soldiers, consoled children in the rubble of ruined schools, and offered hope to countless people who had lost absolutely everything. Her presence in that landscape of devastation provided far more than mere comfort. It offered them a poignant glimpse of what unyielding survival looked like when every other hope had been seemingly extinguished. She accumulated dozens of prestigious honors, including the Presidential Medal of Freedom, one of America's highest civilian awards, bestowed upon her in 1964. Universities around the globe conferred upon her honorary degrees, recognizing her extraordinary intellectual contributions. Foundations and institutions were proudly named in her honor, ensuring her legacy would continue to inspire future generations. Books and films meticulously chronicled her incredible life story. But Helen, ever modest and focused on the true mission, cared little for such trophies or accolades. What truly mattered to her was that blind children had access to books, that deaf adults had meaningful employment opportunities, and that people who had once felt utterly invisible within society now felt truly seen, acknowledged, and valued. Even as her own health steadily declined in her final years, her commitment remained unbroken. She continued to write letters, dictate eloquent messages, and steadfastly support the causes she so deeply believed in. She once famously articulated, "Although the world is full of suffering, it is also full of the overcoming of it. Helen had not merely spoken these words. She had lived both sides of that powerful sentence with every breath, every action. And through it all, she remained fully, fiercely, and unapologetically herself. On June 1st, 1968, at the age of 87, Helen Keller passed away peacefully in her sleep at her home in Westport, Connecticut. A woman once confined by the seemingly impenetrable walls of silence and darkness was now mourned across the entire world by presidents, celebrated poets, passionate activists, and countless everyday people who had never even had the privilege of meeting her. Yet, death itself could not silence her profound impact. Helen had become far more than a mortal person. She had transformed into an indomitable force, an enduring symbol of what the human spirit is truly capable of when handed the absolute worst of life's challenges, yet still dares to rise. Born into a world that, by all conventional measures, offered her nothing, no sight, no sound, no voice, she nonetheless forged a life that left nothing untouched. She fundamentally helped rewrite how society perceived disability, dismantling centuries-old prejudices. She shattered the deeply ingrained idea that blindness automatically equated to helplessness, or that deafness implied ignorance. Helen unequivocally proved that true communication is not confined to the senses of ears or eyes. It emanates, powerfully and profoundly, from the soul itself. Over her extraordinary lifetime, she authored 14 books, delivered hundreds upon hundreds of inspirational speeches, and personally met every U.S. president from Grover Cleveland to Lyndon B. Johnson. She was a catalyst for changing laws, for reforming institutions, but most importantly, she changed minds, millions of them. Her life was never easy, and she never pretended otherwise. She confronted illness, faced sharp rejection, endured profound grief, and navigated intense public criticism with grace and resilience. But she never allowed any of those formidable challenges to define her. Instead, with every act and every word, she defined herself, loudly and unequivocally. She once declared, with characteristic humility and power, "I am only one, but still I am one. I cannot do everything, but still I can do something." And what she did was nothing less than reshape history. Today, schools proudly bear her name. Statues stand in her honor, monumental testaments to her enduring legacy. Her books continue to be read, inspiring new generations, and her powerful quotes are still passed between people in desperate need of strength and hope. And in those moments when life feels overwhelmingly heavy, when silence seems to amplify every fear, when darkness appears to stretch endlessly, her extraordinary legacy reminds us, with profound clarity, that there is always a way through. You may not be able to see it, you may not be able to hear it, but you can be it. Helen Keller never saw a sunrise. She never heard the roar of applause, but she taught the world how to truly listen. And that, unequivocally, is a voice that will never fade. Long before haute couture runways and designer tags became household names, fashion began where civilization itself did, with sunlight, sand, and the raw struggle to survive. In ancient Egypt, fashion was far more than mere practicality. It was deeply sacred, imbued with profound spiritual significance. With the majestic Nile River serving as their gleaming mirror and the vast, golden desert as their dramatic backdrop, Egyptians artfully draped themselves in linen. This fabric, light, breathable, and spun from the flax that flourished along the fertile riverbanks, was perfectly suited to their hot climate. But clothing in Egypt transcended simple climate control. It was a potent spiritual and symbolic language. Pharaohs, embodying divine authority, wore meticulously finely pleated kilts, adorned themselves with golden pectorals, and sported intricate, broad collars encrusted with precious stones like deep blue lapis lazuli, fiery red carnelian, and vivid turquoise. Every color carried a specific meaning. Pristine white symbolized purity and ritual cleanliness. Lush green represented fertility and rebirth, and celestial blue was intrinsically linked to the gods. The more exquisitely detailed the weave, the more exalted and divine your status was perceived to be. Even children were often left unclothed until puberty, their innocence openly displayed, while the elite were wrapped almost like living statues, their meticulously arranged garments reflecting cosmic order and perfect balance in their highly structured society. Across the Fertile Crescent, in the ancient lands of Mesopotamia, fashion served a strikingly similar dual purpose, providing essential protection from the elements and simultaneously denoting prestige. Men typically wore woolen skirts, often secured with decorative belts. Women, on the other hand, favored layered robes and delicate veils. So significant was clothing to their social fabric that the earliest known legal code to mention attire, the formidable Code of Hammurabi, actually dictated with rigid precision who was permitted to wear what. Veils, for instance, were strictly reserved for noble women, while slaves were expressly forbidden from wearing them, a clear marker of social hierarchy. Ancient India, with its vibrant cultural tapestry, brought an explosion of color into the global fashion conversation. Utilizing hand-spun cotton and pioneering early silk production, people wore elegantly draped saris, practical dhotis, and intricately wound turbans, all dyed with rich, plant-based pigments such as deep indigo and earthy madder root. Their textiles were not just garments. They were vivid narratives, telling stories of specific regions, sacred rituals, and the rhythmic cycles of daily life. While the Indus Valley civilization might not have bequeathed us vast volumes of written history, its tiny, exquisite terracotta figurines offer tantalizing glimpses into the hairstyles, elaborate jewelry, and sophisticated textiles that speak across millennia, bridging the gap between ancient worlds and our own. And then there was China, where silk wasn't merely a fabric. It was a monumental revolution, a symbol of unparalleled luxury and power. Legend whispers that Empress Lezu serendipitously discovered silk when a silkworm cocoon gently dropped into her tea. By the time of the powerful Shang dynasty, silk had become a closely guarded state secret, protected with a ferocity usually reserved for gold itself. Who wore this coveted material? Only the elite, the revered rulers, and those deemed heaven's favorites. Even in these nascent stages, fashion was never an arbitrary choice. It powerfully delineated kings from humble servants, distinguished priests from commoners, separated men from women, and, in some profound instances, even set mortals apart from the gods. The precise shape of a flowing robe, the intricate twist of a decorative belt, the exact color of a single thread, each element spoke volumes. Fashion was a sophisticated language before writing was commonplace, an art form before galleries existed, and long before anyone consciously thought. Look at me. Clothes had already captured the world's undivided attention. In the gleaming marble halls of Athens and on the bustling, crowded streets of Rome, fashion evolved beyond mere covering. It became a profound philosophy and a vital uniform of identity. The ancient Greeks, renowned for their pursuit of balance in all things, from their monumental architecture to their philosophical thought, extended this aesthetic to the graceful folds of their garments. Men wore chitons, simple rectangular linen garments artfully pinned at the shoulder and cinched at the waist. Women elegantly draped themselves in peplos or himation cloaks, allowing the fabric to fall in graceful, fluid folds that transformed the body into a living, moving sculpture. Sandals were typically simple and functional. Hairstyles were styled with admirable restraint, and jewelry, though present, was always chosen to complement, never to overwhelm, the overarching sense of harmony. To the Greeks, beauty was intricately linked to morality. Simplicity was synonymous with virtue. Ornamentation was acceptable only as long as it didn't shout, but rather whispered elegance. But then came Rome, and Rome, famously, never whispered. Roman fashion was, above all, about spectacle, overt power, and rigid class distinction. Where the Greeks meticulously draped, the Romans layered and legislated. The toga, fashioned from a single, massive piece of wool often up to 20 feet long, became the ultimate Roman status symbol. Not everyone was permitted to wear one. It was exclusively reserved for male Roman citizens. Even within this elite group, there were strict rules. There was the toga virilis for adult men, the toga praetexta with its distinctive purple stripe, worn by senators and magistrates, and the magnificent toga picta, richly embroidered with gold, reserved solely for emperors and victorious generals. Each type was a carefully constructed costume of authority, proclaiming the wearer's exact place in the societal hierarchy. Beneath their impressive togas, everyone wore tunics, essentially the practical t-shirt of the ancient world. These were simple, knee-length for men and ankle-length for women. Yet, even tunics subtly narrated stories. A wealthy Roman might wear a tunic intricately woven from luxurious Egyptian linen or dyed with the rare and exorbitantly expensive murex purple, a color so precious it was valued more highly than gold itself. Women's fashion in Rome was equally coded and symbolic. The stola distinctively marked a married woman, while the palla, a cloak-like shawl, offered both modesty and graceful movement. Hair was elaborately curled, intricately braided, piled high in sophisticated styles, and sometimes adorned with elegant gold or ivory pins. Fashion wasn't merely about aesthetic beauty. It was a powerful message conveying fertility, virtue, and one's precise social belonging. Even slaves had a fashion role, defined by the specific garments and embellishments they were forbidden to wear. In both Greece and Rome, clothing served a purpose far beyond merely protecting the body. It overtly displayed your rank, your social role, and your citizenship. Every carefully arranged fold, every specific fabric, every chosen color was a deliberate declaration. You didn't just wear a toga, you wore the very essence of the state. While Rome wrapped itself in the pragmatic warmth of wool and Greece in the airy elegance of linen, Asia was meticulously spinning something far more luxurious and transformative: silk. The Silk Road, stretching its intricate network from China all the way to the Mediterranean, was far more than a simple trade route. It was an unparalleled fashion superhighway. It carried not only precious goods, but also revolutionary ideas, exquisite fabrics, and captivating styles that would profoundly shape centuries of dress across continents. At the heart of this ancient fashion empire was China, where silk was not just a coveted export. It was a potent symbol of imperial control and divine favor. For centuries, the closely guarded knowledge of silk production remained a fiercely protected state secret. Only royalty and the highest-ranking officials were permitted to wear the most refined silks, dyed in colors specifically reserved for emperors, such as the brilliant, almost mythical imperial yellow. Chinese robes, particularly during the glorious Tang and Han dynasties, were breathtaking masterpieces of both intricate structure and profound symbolism. Embroidered dragons, graceful phoenixes, and ethereal clouds were not mere decorations. They were potent spiritual markers of rank, destiny, and connection to the cosmos. A person's robe, in effect, communicated more eloquently than any written scroll ever could. Further west, in India, fashion took on a distinctly different character: bold, vibrantly colorful, and sensuously draped. The sari, a timeless garment still gracefully worn today, traces its origins back thousands of years. Woven from exquisitely fine cotton and luxurious silk, and dyed with rich indigo and turmeric, saris were more than just beautiful. They were intricate regional fingerprints. The specific way a woman's sari was folded, the texture of its fabric, and the design of its border could subtly reveal her geographical origin, her caste, and her precise social status. Meanwhile, in Japan, a unique blend of elegance met the practical demands of armor. During the refined Heian period, nobles wore elaborate, layered silk robes known as junahido, their many sleeves and collars revealing carefully coordinated color palettes, a kind of poetic, unspoken fashion code. But as the powerful samurai class rose to prominence, fashion began to pivot toward both function and potent symbolism. This era saw the emergence of the kimono. Worn by both formidable warriors and humble commoners, the kimono evolved into a garment rich with layered meaning. Its fabric, weave, and intricate design communicated season, specific occasion, and even political loyalty. The samurai's kimono, sometimes worn beneath his formidable armor, often displayed a prominent crest boldly announcing his clan allegiance. For geisha and courtiers, the expansive kimono sleeves became intricate canvases for breathtaking artistry. Asian fashion consistently balanced ancient tradition with unparalleled refinement, and subtle restraint with opulent richness. Every precise pleat, every intricate pattern, and every careful stitch was deliberate and imbued with meaning. And as these exquisite fabrics flowed along the vast expanse of the Silk Road, Asia quietly, yet profoundly, taught the world something vital, that clothing was not just about protection or pride. It was culture itself, meticulously sewn into the very fabric of human skin. In medieval and Renaissance Europe, clothing was far more than mere attire. It was an unequivocal declaration of who you were, your station, your identity. From the echoing stone halls of castles to the intimate, candle-lit courts of royalty, fashion became a complex chessboard where every thread was a strategic move and every outfit a powerful declaration of wealth, virtue, or even burgeoning rebellion. During the Middle Ages, clothing was rigidly stratified by class. The impoverished masses wore coarse, undyed wool and simple linen, their garments practical and unassuming. The wealthy, by stark contrast, transformed themselves into walking tapestries of opulence. Fur-lined cloaks, belts studded with glittering jewels, and elaborate brocades loudly signaled both immense wealth and deep piety in equal measure. Dyes were paramount. A deep, vibrant blue denoted significant wealth, while a true, brilliant scarlet was strictly reserved for royalty and high-ranking cardinals. Then came the infamous sumptuary laws, literal legal codes that dictated with exacting precision what one could, or crucially, could not wear, based entirely on their social rank. If an individual dared to wear silk without possessing noble blood, it wasn't merely a fashion faux pas. It was a legitimate crime, punishable by law. In Renaissance Italy, particularly in the thriving city-states of Florence and Venice, fashion blossomed into a magnificent art form. These centers of sartorial innovation created garments so opulent and structurally complex they seemed to defy gravity itself. Men sported dramatically puffed sleeves and stylishly slashed doublets, revealing contrasting fabrics underneath. Women donned luxurious velvet gowns with rigid bodices designed to create an idealized silhouette, and their intricately embroidered sleeves whispered silent stories of family lineage and political power. It was no mere coincidence that during this period of profound intellectual rebirth, fashion became intensely theatrical. The more fabric one wore, the less one was implicitly expected to work. It was a silent, grand performance of status, essentially declaring, "Look how much I can afford to waste." Then came the corset. Originally worn for posture and a modest covering, it swiftly evolved into a powerful tool of silhouette control, cinching waists to impossible proportions, lifting busts, and eventually becoming a complex symbol of both feminine elegance and societal restraint. The ideal woman's body was, in essence, an architectural achievement. And in the grand, opulent courts of France and England, fashion reached dizzying new heights, often quite literally. With towering, elaborate wigs, voluminous ruffled collars, and dresses that required intricate scaffolding underneath, women moved like resplendent, shimmering chandeliers. Men were equally dramatic, sporting tight breeches, sparkling jewels, prominent codpieces, and shoes with exaggerated curled toes that seemed like punctuation marks on their extravagant ensembles. Fashion was an undeniable form of power. A courtier's impeccably chosen gown could curry immense favor with the monarch or, if chosen incorrectly, irrevocably ruin reputations. To be seen was everything. To be seen incorrectly could be perilous. In a world of glittering crowns and whispered conspiracies, clothing functioned as a vital form of armor, not just against the biting cold, but against the far more terrifying threat of irrelevance. By the early 17th century, European fashion had fully embraced a spectacle of breathtaking excess. At the opulent French court of Louis XIV, the Sun King, fashion was not merely a pastime. It was an explicit instrument of royal policy, a carefully orchestrated display of absolute power. Versailles itself functioned as the grandest stage in Europe, and everyone within its gilded confines wore a meticulously crafted costume. Men strutted in sumptuous brocade coats adorned with gleaming gold embroidery, delicate lace cuffs, shimmering silk stockings, and distinctive red-heeled shoes, a sartorial signature directly appropriated from the king himself. Their hair, powdered, perfumed, and piled into towering wigs, was often further embellished with elaborate curls, cascading ribbons, and even miniature ships, creating a truly fantastical silhouette. Women's dresses were architectural wonders of engineering and ornamentation. Wide panniers stretched skirts outward several feet on each side, demanding expansive doorways and careful navigation. Gowns were layered to an almost impossible degree, profusely ruffled, and embroidered within an inch of structural collapse. Skin was powdered to an ethereal white. Cheeks were painted a vivid red, and carefully placed beauty spots dotted the face like artful exclamation points. It was, simultaneously, beautiful, undeniably ridiculous, and profoundly political. In a world where immense wealth unequivocally meant absolute control, fashion became an eloquent language of elite detachment, signaling a profound separation from the common populace. To the nobility, clothing was a potent means to visibly rise above the ordinary. To everyone else, it served as a stark, daily reminder of just how far they had fallen in the social hierarchy. And then, in 1789, came the seismic upheaval of the French Revolution. The people stormed Versailles, not just attacking the physical palace, but relentlessly dismantling everything it symbolized. Unchecked excess, grotesque inequality, the silken finery and satin luxuries purchased at the brutal expense of the people's bread. The guillotine didn't merely fall upon kings and queens. It symbolically descended upon towering wigs, impractical high heels, and restrictive corsets. The fashion of the aristocratic upper class swiftly became the reviled uniform of the enemy. Suddenly, stark simplicity was embraced as the new power. The sans-culottes, literally without breeches, proudly rejected the knee-length aristocratic trousers, opting instead for plain, full-length trousers, the everyday clothing of the working class. To wear extravagant clothes during this revolutionary period was not merely tone-deaf. It was actively dangerous, risking accusations of aristocratic sympathy and potential execution. In the volatile wake of the revolution, fashion itself became profoundly democratic. The classical world of ancient Greece and Rome was idolized, leading to a dramatic shift in aesthetics. Clean lines, natural, flowing fabrics, and Greek-inspired gowns replaced the opulence of the past. Wigs, heavy makeup, and elaborate embellishments vanished almost overnight. Even Napoleon, the pragmatic emperor, understood clothing as a powerful strategy. His iconic military uniform, meticulously designed for both dramatic effect and an aura of supreme authority, helped forge the image of the strong, modern leader. His wife, Empress Josephine, popularized high-waisted gowns crafted from sheer, ethereal fabrics, redefining elegance for the new empire era. But the powdered wig had truly become a relic of a bygone age. Fashion had irrevocably shifted from ostentatiously flaunting wealth to subtly redefining identity in a new social order. The revolution hadn't just changed who ruled France. It had fundamentally altered what people wore to survive it. The 19th century roared in on the hiss of steam engines and the relentless hum of newly invented textile looms. The Industrial Revolution didn't merely transform how people worked, it fundamentally revolutionized how people dressed. Suddenly, beautifully crafted clothing was no longer exclusively reserved for the aristocracy and royalty. Machines could spin, dye, and stitch fabric at speeds unimaginable to human hands, producing textiles with unprecedented efficiency. Mass production meant significantly lower prices, wider availability, and for the very first time in history, fashion began its slow, inexorable trickle down to broader segments of society. Yet, even as manufacturing processes modernized, the prevailing style for women remained deeply rooted in a spectacle of exaggerated volume, dramatic, sweeping, and often bordering on the absurd. The pivotal invention of the crinoline, a cage-like steel frame worn beneath skirts, allowed women to wear dresses that ballooned outward to incredible dimensions, resembling vast, open umbrellas. Some of these contraptions reached 6 feet in diameter, forcing women to navigate doorways sideways and to practically orbit within ballroom circles. The implicit message was clear. If you could afford to wear a dress that actively prevented work, restricted comfortable walking, or even made sitting a challenge, you were undoubtedly wealthy enough not to care about such practicalities. Meanwhile, corsets tightened even further, sculpting waists into impossibly tiny, wasp-like proportions. The ideal woman became a fragile hourglass, seemingly floating on a voluminous sea of silk, lace, and tulle. Fashion, in this era, was both a restrictive prison and an elevated pedestal. For men, fashion settled into sharp, sober, and decidedly restrained lines. Impeccably tailored tailcoats, crisp waistcoats, towering top hats, the unmistakable uniform of the respectable gentleman. It was during this period that the modern suit began to take its familiar form. Clean, understated, professional, conveying dignity without any hint of flashiness. But beneath this surface of structured formality, new trends were stirring. Department stores began to spring up in burgeoning cities, offering ready-made clothes to a rapidly expanding middle class. Fashion magazines, like the influential Godey's Ladies' Book and La Belle Assembly, emerged as powerful arbiters of taste, shaping desires and setting trends. And with the nascent technology of photography, people could now see what fashion looked like far beyond the confines of their immediate village. The rise of the sewing machine in the 1850s brought yet another transformative shift, not just in large-scale production, but in personal creativity. Home sewing patterns became immensely popular, suddenly making fashionable style accessible to millions. Fashion was no longer solely the domain of the elite. It was rapidly becoming a powerful tool for individual expression. Even Queen Victoria, with her immense influence, left her indelible mark on fashion, popularizing the white wedding dress, the somber elegance of mourning black, and the broader societal value of modesty. In this new industrial world, clothes no longer merely reflected existing identity. They were actively building it, one meticulously stitched thread at a time. As the 20th century dawned, fashion stood at a precarious crossroads, torn between the corseted elegance and restrictive silhouettes of the past and the burgeoning liberation roaring in with the future. Then came the cataclysm of World War I, and everything irrevocably changed. With men mobilized for battle, women stepped into factories, worked in fields, and filled crucial office roles. The corset, once a non-negotiable daily ritual, became utterly impractical, even dangerous, in these new, demanding environments. Skirts mercifully shortened, fabrics lightened, and practicality suddenly became a patriotic virtue. Women donning uniforms, trousers, and simple, tailored coats began, quite literally, to rewrite the very definition of femininity through their attire. After the war, having tasted this new freedom, they were unwilling to retreat into the old constraints. The 1920s triumphantly ushered in a new archetype, the daring, defiant flapper. She wore revolutionary drop-waist dresses that allowed for unprecedented freedom of movement, bobbed her hair into a stylish, daring cut, painted her lips a bold red, and danced with wild abandon in clandestine speakeasies, often with a cigarette holder held elegantly in one hand and a spirit of unapologetic rebellion in the other. Her dresses shimmered with fringes and beads that swayed with every Charleston step. Her scandalously revealed knees shocked conservative society, and her palpable confidence defied generations of restrictive norms. This was fashion as ultimate freedom, as a vibrant refusal to conform. Meanwhile, the men of the Jazz Age embraced sharp, impeccably tailored suits, stylish wide-legged trousers, slick-back hair, and fashionable Oxford shoes. Hollywood played a pivotal role in glamorizing this new image, both on screen and off. Iconic stars like the enigmatic Greta Garbo and the suave Clark Gable set trends that audiences across the globe eagerly followed. Then came the devastating stock market crash of 1929. The Great Depression of the 1930s forced fashion back toward a stark conservatism. Hemlines dropped in sober deference to economic hardship. Colors dulled, reflecting the prevailing mood. People were forced to mend and make do instead of buying new garments. Style didn't vanish entirely, it profoundly adapted. Old garments were ingeniously reworked, and even humble flour sacks were resourcefully transformed into dresses. Movie stars, however, remained beacons of hope amid the economic despair, becoming enduring style icons whose glamour provided a fleeting escape from the harsh realities of daily life. When the full brunt of World War II descended, the world of fashion, much like every other aspect of life, transformed into a relentless battlefield. Scarcity became the defining principle. Materials previously taken for granted were rationed with an iron fist, forcing a dramatic simplification of silhouettes. Skirts, once flowing, became notably shorter, jackets grew boxier, and fabrics, often chosen for durability over drape, became stiffer and less yielding. In the United States, the War Production Board intervened directly, issuing strict L-85 regulations that meticulously dictated the maximum amount of cloth permissible in civilian garments. This meant an end to elaborate details. No pleats, no cuffs on sleeves or trousers, no extra pockets, all to conserve precious resources for the war effort. Nylon, a marvel of modern synthetic innovation that had revolutionized women's stockings, was immediately redirected, its strength and lightness now vital for manufacturing parachutes and military gear. Across war-torn Europe, women adopted utility clothing, a stark, efficient, and often uniform-like aesthetic born of necessity. Men, many of whom had been wearing civilian clothes just months prior, returned to the regimented lines of service dress and battle dress. Yet, from these stringent limitations, a remarkable spirit of innovation bloomed. Women, stepping into factories and traditionally male roles, embraced slacks with unprecedented frequency, valuing their practicality and mobility. Shoulder pads, far from mere adornment, added a structured, assertive silhouette that conveyed strength and purpose. Even amidst the somber austerity, a flicker of artistic defiance emerged. Visionary fashion designers like Elsa Schiaparelli, ever the provocateur, introduced surreal elements into her collections, seemingly thumbing her nose at the grim realities and celebrating the power of imagination. In the face of global conflict, fashion transcended mere style. It became a declaration of resilience, a subtle yet potent signal to the world that even in chaos, humanity retained the agency to choose who they were and how they presented themselves to survive, both physically and psychologically. As the world slowly emerged from the shadow of World War II, it was battered and weary, but profoundly hungry for beauty, for hope, for a return to joy. And in 1947, the legendary French designer Christian Dior answered that yearning with an unparalleled flourish. He unveiled what the press immediately christened the new look. This revolutionary silhouette dramatically reshaped the female form, featuring impeccably cinched waists, sumptuously full, sweeping skirts that often required yards of fabric, softly rounded shoulders, and the exquisite feel of delicate, luxurious fabrics. It was a dramatic, almost defiant, return to opulence and a fervent celebration of femininity, luxury, and a sense of controlled, deliberate elegance. For countless women who had endured years of rations, austerity, and utilitarian uniforms, Dior's new look felt like a collective sigh of relief, like breathing deeply again after holding their breath for too long. However, not everyone applauded this lavish revival. To some, particularly feminists and those who had embraced the newfound practicality and freedom of wartime dress, the new look felt like a regressive step, a return to restrictive ideals and an artificial, decorative femininity. This inherent tension between tradition and transformation, between aspiration and practicality, would become a defining characteristic of fashion debates for decades to come. As the 1950s unfolded, American suburbia became the arbiter of a clean-cut, aspirational style, reflecting a post-war prosperity and a yearning for stability. Pearls adorned the necks of women in demure pencil skirts, while men sported impeccably tailored gray flannel suits. Everything, it seemed, was ironed to perfection, a visual manifestation of societal order. Yet, beneath this polished, seemingly serene surface, a potent rebellion was quietly brewing. Teenagers, a newly recognized and rapidly expanding demographic with their own burgeoning culture and spending power, began to vehemently reject their parents' staid, conformist look. They idolized emerging screen rebels like James Dean and Marlon Brando, whose seemingly effortless style, plain white t-shirts, rugged leather jackets, and well-worn blue jeans, exuded a raw, honest, and thrillingly dangerous allure. And there it was, denim. Once the sturdy, unassuming uniform of the American working class, denim underwent a remarkable metamorphosis, becoming the undisputed uniform of youth rebellion. It wasn't fashion prescribed from above. It was fashion claimed, appropriated, and imbued with personal meaning by a generation eager to assert its identity. Then burst forth the 1960s, an era when revolution wasn't merely televised, it was vibrantly worn. London's dynamic mod culture gave birth to the sharp lines of slim suits, the defiant daring of miniskirts, and an explosion of bold, graphic prints. Simultaneously, the burgeoning hippie movement embraced the intricate beauty of embroidery, the sweeping drama of bell-bottoms, and the conscious coolness of second-hand chic. Fashion, in this tumultuous decade, became overtly political, a powerful visual declaration against war, against the establishment, and against virtually everything that had come before. By the 1970s, the once clear lines between high fashion and street style had delightfully blurred. Haute couture still thrived, but streetwear had unequivocally found its voice, asserting its influence with unprecedented confidence. Music became the primary driver of fashion, each genre spawning its own distinctive aesthetic, from the glittering sequins and flamboyant silhouettes of disco to the defiant torn shirts and safety pin-adorned ensembles of punk rock. And through it all, jeans, the enduring symbol of individual expression, remained a constant, dressed up, distressed, or ripped in defiant protest. Designers like the elegant Yves Saint Laurent and the iconoclastic Vivienne Westwood keenly understood this shifting tide. Fashion was no longer solely dictated from the top down by a select few. It had transformed into a dynamic two-way mirror, simultaneously reflecting and shaping the world around it. Clothes were no longer just about class or gender. They had become potent vehicles for attitude, identity, and resistance. From Dior's luxurious silks to Levi's ubiquitous denim, fashion had become something entirely new, not just what you wore, but profoundly, definitively, who you were. As the 20th century drew to a close, fashion shed its final skin, evolving from a prescriptive question of what should we wear, to an introspective exploration of who are we? The 21st century dawned with an electrifying new energy, one intrinsically driven by the complex tapestry of identity, the celebration of diversity, and the relentless march of the digital age. Fashion was no longer exclusively ruled by the seasonal trends whispered and paraded in the hallowed halls of Paris and Milan. Now, it pulsed and proliferated through the immediate, democratic platforms of Instagram and TikTok, manifesting on the vibrant street corners of Seoul, Nairobi, and New York simultaneously. Trends became global and instant, capable of being sparked by a single teenager with a smartphone, who could ignite a movement faster and more widely than any traditional runway ever could. The rapid ascent of fast fashion brands like Zara, H&M, and Forever 21 made catwalk-inspired styles more accessible to the masses than ever before, churning out garments at lightning speed. However, this accessibility came with a heavy cost: devastating environmental damage, exploitative labor practices, and a growing, uncomfortable awareness of fashion's darker side. In response, sustainability rapidly emerged as a new, crucial standard. Designers began to fundamentally rethink materials, minimize waste, and shoulder a greater sense of responsibility. Thrift stores surged in popularity, upcycling became a coveted skill, and concepts like capsule wardrobes and the mantra, "buy less, choose well," transformed into guiding principles for conscious consumers. But perhaps the most profound revolution was in representation. For decades, the fashion industry had narrowly favored one body type, one skin tone, one narrowly defined ideal of beauty. Now, that industry is undergoing a seismic shift. Designers are actively casting models of all races, sizes, genders, and abilities. Runways, once homogeneous, now feature hijabs, wheelchairs, vitiligo, and drag queens, moving what once existed only on the margins firmly into the center stage. Fashion became a vital battleground for cultural conversations. Think Black Lives Matter slogans emblazoned on haute couture gowns, pride parades featuring high heels and glitter as powerful protest armor, and indigenous designers reclaiming traditional patterns as a vibrant statement of survival and cultural pride. Gender, once a restrictive cage, began to dissolve. From sophisticated androgynous tailoring to skirts appearing on men's racks, the binary boundaries of fashion started to beautifully blur. Icons like Billy Porter, Harry Styles, and Zendaya wore clothes not just as statements, but as pure, unadulterated expressions of personal freedom. And beyond the physical realm, in the burgeoning metaverse, avatars strut in dazzling outfits that defy the laws of physics and can't even exist in real life. Digital fashion, no fabric, no waste, just pixels and boundless imagination, is rapidly becoming its own electrifying frontier. Fashion now lives everywhere, permeating every corner of the globe, and crucially, it belongs to everyone. What began as humble linen draped around ancient Egyptians thousands of years ago has evolved into a sophisticated global language. It is a language capable of whispering profound traditions, screaming audacious rebellion, or simply, confidently saying, "This is me." Because, in the end, fashion is far more than just what we wear. It is, irrevocably, how we show the world who we truly are.